but also because it was an entirely vertical cliff face. It was nearly impossible to find any foothold. Just thinking about it gave you chills. And just as that thought crossed his mind, Myung slipped. He went into free fall, plunging straight down the cliffside. Myung genuinely felt doomed. Could it be that after just recently being reincarnated, he was already about to meet his end? Fortunately, though, he had come prepared. There was still a rope tied around his waist holding him back. Manhwa, the name is surely no stranger to those who have ventured into the world of Legend of Woolen. Also, a disciple of Manhwa, fully mastered all the secret sword techniques. With profound inner strength, Myung is revered by the world as the Plum Blossom Swordmaster. But in the final battle against the demon cult leader, though he managed to end him, he also passed away due to his severe injuries. He reborn in the form of a beggar child. He heard that Manhwa was on the brink of collapse. With his abilities, can the Plum Blossom Swordmaster rebuild the sect and once again stand at the peak of the martial world? All around him was blood. Vast and endless, nothing but the color of blood. That was all the young man could see before his eyes. Aside from the blood, there were only countless broken corpses of those who had fallen. The young man truly couldn't understand why they had to sacrifice so much, for what purpose. The young man looked toward his senior brother. Just moments earlier, his uncle had been struck by a single blow that pierced through part of his body. He looked around once more. He looked toward his master and the other brothers. All of them had been sent to their deaths in the most miserable state. Even this young man himself. At this moment, he had already lost one arm and a sword was piercing through his shoulder. This place had gathered elites from more than 20 sects, the finest among the finest, all just to stand against the Chunma. And in the end, what they got in return was total annihilation. And who exactly is the Chunma? He is the figure pierced by countless swords sitting cross-legged atop the towering mountain before their eyes. At that moment, the Chunma also spoke, Manhwa sect truly cursed with misfortune. Those words made the one-armed young man feel utterly humiliated. No matter how much pain his body was in, he still forced himself to stand and face the Chunma. The Chunma said that if the young man could finish him off and leave this place, then indeed a bright future would be waiting for him. However, fate had already decided that no one would leave this place alive. Whether it was the young man or the Chunma, it made no difference. The Chunma sighed, saying the young man could be proud of himself now. With the help of many others, the young man had managed to drive his sword into the Chunma's body, so he should feel honored for that. The young man forcefully pulled the sword embedded in his shoulder out, gripping it tightly in his hand. He shouted loudly, telling the Chunma to shut his damn mouth. All that rambling was giving him a headache. The Chunma treated the young man's words like the buzzing of a mosquito near his ear, sighing to himself that if only he had one more day to prepare. Then he could have shown the entire world what the true power of the Chunma really was. The Chunma declared that this was not the end. The demonic path will rise once more, and when it does, the era of the D-Devil's worship sect shall begin. Since the Chunma wouldn't shut his mouth, the young man had no choice but to take action. He dashed swiftly toward the Chunma's position. Then he swung his sword horizontally. In an instant, the Chunma's head had said farewell to his body, and then soared into the air. Before rolling down the hill, tumbling over the piles of corpses, the young man figured the war had come to an end, and so had his own life. So had the Manhwa sect. Most of the disciples of Manhwa had buried their lives in this great battle. Only a few children managed to escape. The young man suddenly felt a fleeting moment of regret. If only he had tried a little harder in his training. Maybe he would have survived. The young man fell onto the pile of corpses, gradually losing consciousness. He is Plum Blossom Sword Saint's Chung Myung, the one who ended the Chunma. Those are the final records of this chapter of history. As his consciousness gradually faded into darkness, Myung recalled his past. From a child who was abandoned, he was taken in and raised by the Manhwa sect. He grew up in the Manhwa sect, enduring the constant nagging from his senior brothers. Myung was a genius, but he was lazy. He silently regretted that if only he had practiced a little harder. If he had been a little stronger, perhaps he could have changed this terrible outcome. The scene suddenly shifted to a dilapidated, tattered hut. The boy had just been hit with a blow that left him dazed. He hurriedly shielded himself against the person he believed to be the resurrected Chunma seeking revenge. But looking closer, it was just a ragged young thug holding a stick. It's clearly the stick had just struck the boy's head. The boy hadn't fully grasped what was happening yet. He felt it was ridiculous that a ragged young thug could threaten him. The boy waved his hand and said, "Buddy, you're mistaken. Put the stick down, let's chat like friends and see what's going on." The young boy saw the kid in front of him call him buddy. Then he burst out laughing like a madman, making the kid even more confused. He himself was none other than the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Even the leader of the Beggar sect had to bow his head in greeting when meeting him. But this beggar dared to strike him on the head with a stick like that. Seeing that mischievous kid raise his stick again as if he wanted to strike once more, Myung silently thought to himself, first block the opponent's strike, then teach him a proper lesson in manners. But hold on. When Myung reached out his hand, he was suddenly so shocked that he froze in place. He couldn't understand why his arm was suddenly so short, as if it had been cut off halfway. With such short arms, how could he possibly block the strike? The outcome didn't even need to be guessed. Myung got smacked hard right on the top of his head by the opponent's stick. It hurt like hell. That brat was like a wild beast. He swung his stick like crazy, leaving Myung dizzy and reeling. Another little beggar peeked his head in to watch. Seeing that brat stuffing scallions into Myung's mouth, the other kid pretended to be blind. Better get out of here. After that, no one knew whether Myung managed to escape or if that brat decided to let him go. But somehow Myung had made his way to the bank of a stream. Thinking back on the beating he just took, Myung burned with anger and swore that the brat would have to pay back tenfold before he could feel satisfied. Only now did Myung finally have some time. He looked down at the water to check his appearance. He had the strange feeling that he had been reincarnated. At that moment, the young brat from earlier also showed up, having tracked down Myung. Without giving the other a chance to talk nonsense, he handed over a wooden ladle and said he had 2 questions to ask. First, he needed to confirm one thing. Could it be that I'm actually a beggar? The kid in front of him didn't know what to say. Myung just had to look at his current appearance to understand everything. Even if Myung didn't want to accept this truth, he had no choice but to grit his teeth and face it. Setting that matter aside for now, Myung wanted to know the current state of the Chunma. The kid in front of him actually knew a bit about this. That Chunma guy must have been the great demon who got taken down 100 years ago, right? Myung stood there in a daze for a long while. Then he suddenly panicked because that kid had just said 100 years ago. Myung had thought the brat was lying at first. That made him lose his temper. He grabbed the other kid by the collar, demanding answers. But the brat insisted he had no reason to lie to Myung. Myung once again fell into a stunned, frozen state. If he was going to be reincarnated, then why not do it right away? Why did they have to throw Myung 100 years into the future? This made Myung feel as if he were completely alone in the world. Suddenly Myung remembered something. He wanted to know the current situation of the manhwa sect. But the kid had absolutely no idea what that sect was. Myung asked again, are you even a real beggar? If you're the real deal, then you must belong to a sect. And if you're part of a sect, how could you not know about the legendary manhwa sect, the #1 in the martial world? The little beggar kid figured Myung was completely out of his mind. Right now there are 9 major sects, but there isn't a damn sect called manhwa anywhere. Hearing that devastating news, Myung was shaken to his core once again. Myung noticed that among the 9 great sects, there was one called the Southern Island sect. Those little chicks, them being a major sect, is just ridiculous. Whatever, forget about that. What Myung cared about more was why manhwa wasn't listed among the 9 great sects. The beggar kid opposite him shook his head so hard it felt like his brain was rattling. Suddenly he remembered there really was a sect called manhwa on the Western Island, right? Exactly. manhwa is indeed on the Western Island, but it's not one of the major sects. It's just a sect on the verge of extinction. You could say Myung went through shock after shock. Now he was hearing news about his own sect. The sect that was once one of the 3 most famous in the world now only had a few remnants left. It was truly hard to accept. Myung froze when the beggar kid suddenly let go of his collar without warning, causing the other kid to fall flat on the ground. Myung absolutely refused to believe this was true. He had to verify it for himself. He needed to go directly to manhwa himself. That kid again said Myung was completely out of his mind. If he didn't want to get beaten again, it was best for him to crawl off and beg for food. Myung still maintained the attitude that only he had the right to question things here and continued to demand the kid in front of him answer a few more questions. First, Myung needed to know about his current body. What is the name of his current appearance? The kid bluntly said that a beggar doesn't need a formal name, just call him whatever he looks like. As for his age, Myung didn't get a clear answer, but judging by his tiny stature, he was probably around 10 years old at most. Myung decided to put aside the matter of names and age for now. He asked the kid in front of him to be his friend from now on. Myung declared herself the type of person who repays kindness and definitely avenges wrongs. Remember the name Myung, and the next time we meet, I will definitely repay your kindness, said the kid in front of him. Myung turned and left. But after only a few steps, Myung hastily turned back. Because he was terrible with directions. If he didn't ask for directions, he probably wouldn't find his way back to manhwa, even by next mandarin orange season. Then Myung tucked in his legs and ran. He cheered himself on telling himself that even in his previous life, he was a very nimble person. But that was a story from his previous life. But with his current scrawny body, Myung had only run for 15 minutes before collapsing face first onto the road from exhaustion. Myung felt like he was going to kick the bucket. Before even reaching manhwa, Myung lay sprawled on the road pondering for a long time. After that, he broke into a goofy grin. If running is too tiring, then Myung just needs to practice light body martial arts. Myung suddenly felt a pang of regret. If only he had been a bit more diligent in his previous life. Instead of sneaking off to sleep every time his senior disciple brother asked for physical training, he would have already mastered the basic techniques. Myung also regretted sneaking off to drink alcohol instead of training. Oh, but never mind that. The alcohol was too good. Even if he had the choice again, Myung still wouldn't be able to give it up. Myung stepped into the forest by the roadside. He chose a spacious area free from external disturbances to begin his training anew. Myung was confident that he possessed countless supreme secret techniques. He could bring out the entire martial arts repertoire of manhwa and practice it as easily as eating a piece of cake. Among the countless supreme martial arts techniques of manhwa sect, Myung made a quick assessment and decided to begin training with the equilibrium. This martial art technique wasn't even considered anything valuable. Out on the street, you could buy a copy for just a few coins. Though its value was ordinary, its quality was anything but mediocre. The equilibrium was the foundational martial art of the manhwa sect. Every disciple had to start with it. Although the equilibrium didn't grant exceptional inner strength, once mastered, this internal technique could purify the entire body perfectly. Therefore, the equilibrium was fully worthy of being the perfect foundational technique for the massive tower of inner strength to be built later. Myung focused on regulating the internal energy within his body. The blue stream of inner energy flowed through each of Myung's meridians, gradually spreading across his entire body, slowly purifying it. After a full cycle of refining his inner energy, Myung directed its most essential essence to flow toward his dantian. Then it gathered there once again. Just like that, Myung had completed the very first basic step, and it felt as if he had undergone a complete transformation. Myung, filled with excitement, was about to rush straight to Mount Hua, but he had only taken 2 steps forward. He suddenly collapsed to the ground. Myung had forgotten one important thing. After training with the equilibrium technique, his body would be completely exhausted and unable to move immediately. He could already imagine the mocking expression on his senior brother's face. He mocked Myung, saying, "You can even forget something that minor." Then in a small village, a group of beggar kids frantically ran off to find their leader. He was an older beggar, more mature than the rest. They reported that some strange beggar had just appeared in town, and this guy had completely disrupted their entire begging operation. Having their food stolen was something they simply couldn't tolerate. The lead beggar immediately decided to go teach the outsider a lesson. The group of beggars quickly located the strange beggar's position. At that moment, the stranger was burying his face in a pile of steamed buns, stuffing them into his mouth one after another. The group of beggars called out to him for a while, before the stranger finally bothered to turn around and respond. And the newly arrived beggar was none other than Myung himself. The lead beggar felt his blood boil as Myung spoke to him with such an even, condescending tone. He decided he had to teach the boy a lesson about respecting his elders. Even heaven wouldn't interrupt a man's meal yet. Here came a bunch of fools picking a fight right when he needed to recharge. Myung had no choice but to get moving a little now. Myung cracked his joints. He threw a test punch into the air. He was starting to feel more and more familiar with this body. Those beggars could charge in all at once if they wanted. It would save him time anyway. Myung didn't forget to remind them that his current body was too weak to hit hard, so they'd just have to take a few extra beatings to make up for it. The lead beggar, seeing how arrogant Myung was acting, became furious. He immediately ordered 2 of his underlings to charge in at the same time and ambush Myung. One of them threw a punch straight toward Myung's face, but Myung simply tilted his head slightly and effortlessly dodged the attack. Next, Myung struck back with a counterattack. 1 punch was enough to knock the beggar's jaw out of place. Myung shouted loudly, "I am Plum Blossom Swordsmanship of the Mount Hua sect. Those beggars dared to mess with him. They're asking for trouble." Then nothing unexpected happened. Myung gave those 3 beggars such a beating that their faces turned pale. After they learned their lesson, they obediently knelt down. Myung then leisurely ate all the steamed buns he had. Then he asked how to get to the western island as quickly as possible. Unfortunately, Myung asked the wrong people. If those guys knew the way, they'd be working as tour guides. Instead of being a miserable beggar, Myung gave a harmless smile. Then suddenly, he grabbed the collar of the beggar holding the stick. He gently advised the other to quickly broaden his knowledge. If next time he needs to ask for information, and they still don't know, then he's in big trouble. The sky was dyed a blazing red from the sunset. At some mountain peak, a middle-aged man was requested by his subordinate Am to pay a visit. He glanced into the room and said that there was a boy who wanted to meet the great man. And the boy was none other than Myung. He had made his way to Mount Hua sect, and was eager to join the sect immediately. The middle-aged man, upon hearing that Myung had come here to become a disciple, did not respond hastily. Instead, he turned to the young man named Am and asked, clearly reminding him that he had instructed not to accept any more child disciples. Am had already explained this to Myung. However, Myung was too stubborn, so Am had no choice but to give in. At that moment, Myung was wearing a radiant smile, but who knows that inside he is burning with anger right now. Not long before that, after dragging himself to the point where his legs were about to break, Myung had finally arrived at the foot of Mount Hua. Although his body was on the verge of giving up, but Myung's reason suppressed that intention mercilessly. He was determined to go to the top of Mount Hua right away. Myung leaned on his staff, dragging himself step by step up the stone stairs. Then he climbed the steep, muddy slope. It got even harder. He had to switch to free climbing just to keep moving forward. Even the sheer cliffs, dangerously vertical, couldn't stop him. Myung refused to give up. He was already so close to the peak of Mount Hua. Upon reaching the mountain peak, Myung didn't even have much time to catch his breath. He let out a desperate scream in utter panic. When he saw the structure in front of him, the signboard of the Mount Hua sect was nowhere to be found. That very signboard, the one Myung's senior brother used to carefully climb up and clean every single morning, now it had completely vanished. Myung screamed in panic, feeling like he was about to lose his mind. And it was precisely Myung's shouting that made Am inside curious enough to peek out and see what was going on. Am was a bit surprised indeed. How could a kid like Myung possibly find his way all the way to Mount Hua on his own? Myung ignored the need to explain. He urgently wanted to know whether the current head of the Mount Hua sect was a true master who had attained enlightenment. Upon receiving Am's confirmation, Myung felt a bit relieved. Luckily, Mount Hua wasn't completely ruined just yet. Am invited Myung to enter the sect, even though they no longer welcomed outsiders. But standing before him was a kid who not only knew about Mount Hua sect, but had also made his way there all on his own. It wouldn't be right to coldly turn him away. As he stepped into the main hall, Myung was once again shocked. Where was the brilliantly polished stone floor etched into his memory? All he saw before him now was a patch of uneven, filthy ground. Myung tried to convince himself that maybe during hard times, the sect had sold the stone floor. After all, it was just a few stones, no need to make a big deal out of it. He forced a smile and told Am, "This place is really spacious and beautiful." "Hey, but hold on a second. Why was the temple that used to stand on the cliff also nowhere to be seen now? Myung quickly tried to change the subject. He said that the cliff over there seemed a bit oddly arranged, like something was missing, just to see how Onam would explain it. Onam also agreed that the area did feel rather empty. There used to be a building there. However, the explanation Myung received was far from what he had hoped for. Onam simply said, "You're just a kid, no need to ask so many questions." Onam muttered something under his breath about glorious battle scars or whatever, which made Myung nearly explode, wanting to shout, "Glory my ass." Onam continued leading Myung deeper into the architecture complex. They arrived in front of Yuyuan Temple. This was also the place that gave Myung the feeling it had remained the most intact. Well, that was just on the outside. But when Myung peeked inside, it felt completely off. In front of him was the ancestral altar, so simple it couldn't have been any more plain. Clearly there should have been golden candle holders here, and even the incense burner was supposed to be made of gold personally bestowed by the emperor himself. And what about all those golden decorative statues? Where had they all gone? Myung walked forward in a daze. He couldn't help but blurt out, "Wasn't there supposed to be a flower here?" Onam was a bit curious, how could this kid in front of him know so much about things that once belonged to manhwa sect? In theory, there should have been a white metal flower there, but that had already been sold. Onam said that the flower was useless anyway. Besides, it didn't really match the look of the hall, so they sold it when they got a good offer. Myung dropped to his knees right on the spot. He silently thought of his sect leader, senior brother, and lamented Mount Hua has fallen. Although the flower branch wasn't made of gold or silver, it was the symbol of Mount Hua's sect, the spirit emblem of Mount Hua itself. Myung couldn't let the desolation and chill that had fallen over Mount Hua continue any longer. He had no choice but to take action. Myung requested to meet the current sect leader of Mount Hua. He must become a disciple of Mount Hua at any cost. Returning to the present moment, Myung stood before the current sect leader of the Mount Hua sect. Myung guessed that it wouldn't be easy for him to be accepted into the sect. But he had already prepared a perfect plan. Myung claimed that he had been separated and lost in a mountain due to the chaos of war. Then he was rescued by a nearby woodcutter. Coincidentally, the woodcutter was a disciple of Mount Hua and had taught him martial arts. Moreover, Myung even planned to exaggerate the woodcutter's status, claiming he held a very high position in the sect, so that he could be on equal rank with the current sect leader. Myung's story sounded wildly exaggerated and unbelievable, but he was still waiting for the sect leader to speak first and ask about him. But the sect leader made an unexpected move. He directly agreed to let Myung join the Mount Hua sect right away to speed things up. Myung was shocked and furious. How could the sect leader agree so easily like that? Onam was just as curious and confused. Clearly the sect leader had declared no more disciples would be accepted, but now he explained that he had changed his mind. Myung coming to Mount Hua sect was fate. If it was fate, then he should not be rejected. The sect leader felt that having a child who knew about their sect and even came here on his own was something worth acknowledging. If Myung truly wants to join the sect, then just let him join. Myung's carefully laid plan was completely shattered. After that, Myung had no choice but to accept his fate. He put on the robes of a third-generation disciple of Mount Hua. Then Myung quickly glanced around the room he had just been led into. It looked quite old, and it seemed like this place was meant for guests to stay. Myung had absolutely no memory of this living area. In his previous life, after completing the master worship ceremony, the disciple would stay at the master's training ground. Myung curiously wandered around looking. He looked into a room and it seemed like someone was staying there. Just then a sound came from behind Myung. A kid with a cropped head suddenly appeared and yelled that Myung was a thief sneaking into someone else's room. The loud shout of mole-headed guy attracted the attention of the other disciples. The whole group quickly gathered in this direction. The mole-headed guy turned to a young man, who was a little taller than him, called him senior brother, and accused Myung of peeking into his room. Just then a middle-aged man also entered. He yelled at his disciples why they were gathering here during practice time. The kids saw the middle-aged man appear and immediately bowed and apologized. The other party was their warden. The middle-aged man found Myung quite a stranger. Then he realized that he was the child who had just joined the sect. Myung just joined today so he can rest first. But from tomorrow he also has to join the training with his fellow students. As for the remaining disciples, there was no time to rest. The uncle shouted at them to return to the training ground immediately. The mole-headed guy, before running off, still managed to turn back and give Myung a dangerous look. Then he kindly warned that after school, Myung should meet him for a chat, and he would fix Myung's bad habits. Myung looked at the other person and offered a gentle smile. He felt his juniors were truly adorable. He needed to carefully prepare his curriculum to take care of these guys. It was night. Myung stood facing the mole-headed guy. Around them other kids watched intently, and the mole-headed kid even told him to take off his clothes. The mole-headed kid felt his request was only natural. Myung just needed to do a few stripper dances, then take another thorough beating, and he'd surely understand true brotherhood right away. Myung's face turned as black as a pot's bottom. But he wasn't in a hurry to act. First, he needed to confirm where the supervisor was. The mole-headed kid thought Myung wanted to call for backup, but there was no way. The supervisor wouldn't be watching the kids at night. The mole-headed kid was losing patience. He felt he needed to give Myung a beating first to make him understand the situation, then they could talk further. At this moment, Myung asked a completely unrelated question, asking if the mole-headed guy's neck was tough enough. Then, without waiting for the other person to grasp the situation, a punch then landed squarely on the mole-headed guy's chin. He punched him so hard he flew right through the roof. The remaining kids stared with wide eyes and open mouths, not understanding what had just happened. But these guys don't need to understand. Next, Myung will carefully take care of each one of them. After giving each of his fellow disciples a few more lumps on their heads, Myung then let his senior disciple brother Sahyung Yoon Jong massage his shoulders to relieve the pressure after a vigorous workout. Next, Myung called out to the mole-headed guy again, because he came forward before him. It wasn't that Myung wanted to take care of the other person for another round. He just had a few questions to ask. The first thing Myung wanted to know was what happened to Heavenly Golden Palace, that very palace that had vanished from the cliff. Jo-gul didn't answer directly. Instead, he asked Myung if he knew Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Are you kidding? How could I not know I am Plum Blossom Sword Saint here? Jo-gul recounted that according to historical records, the Plum Blossom Sword Saint was the one who sent Chun Ma to meet the King of Hell. After that, Chun Ma's minions flew into a rage, swarming Mount Hua and engulfing the place in flames. Following that incident, Mount Hua suffered immense damage and has yet to return to its golden age. Myung suddenly felt a pang of guilt. So he had indirectly pushed Mount Hua into its current situation. Then, in Myung's past life memory, the sect leader brother had consulted him about the Tai Yi Flummox sword technique being too pathetic. Or perhaps it should be struck from the list of Mount Hua's sword techniques. Myung just casually agreed. In his opinion, if any sword technique was too useless, they might as well just toss it out. It's better that way. The decision was already made. Besides, the sect leader senior brother suggested that Myung should start taking in disciples and begin passing down his knowledge little by little. As for the matter of teaching, Myung already had a complete and well-structured curriculum prepared. First, he'd beat the living daylights out of those cocky newcomers, then think about teaching them later. At that moment, Myung was lying on the bed deep in thought. He heard his senior brother calling him. The latter said that the instructor wanted all disciples to gather at the training grounds. From now on, Myung would also need to join the training sessions with everyone else. In the training yard, a senior brother stood on the high platform at the front. He shouted at the top of his lungs, instructing the junior disciples below to swing their swords along with him. Myung stood to the side watching with wide eyes in utter disbelief. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. What the hell kind of crappy sword technique are these disciples even swinging around right now? The instructor nearby explained that the disciples were practicing the beginner sword technique. Just look at this sword technique. Doesn't it seem more like a joke than real training? Myung felt that only a bunch of clueless kids would bother practicing something this ridiculous. Myung felt he had no choice but to step in. Mount Hua was falling apart from the top down. He slowly walked straight toward the high platform where the senior brother was demonstrating the sword technique. In his mind, he couldn't stop sighing, wondering where the fate of Mount Hua would drift to from here. Myung turned to ask a disciple to see what basic sword techniques the disciples would be learning. The disciple eagerly listed off several sword techniques, then concluded that only after mastering all the basic forms would they be allowed to learn the essence of Mount Hua, the Tai Yi Flummox sword. So that's the exact same worthless sword technique. The very one that Myung and the sect leader senior brother had once discussed together. That evening, Myung called Jo-gul over to have a little chat. He asked Jo-gul to gather all the disciples in front of the White Plum Blossom boarding house at 5 a.m. tomorrow. After that, Myung also assigned Jo-gul to prepare a whole bunch of miscellaneous items. The good thing was, after receiving a heartfelt beating, Jo-gul became very obedient. So whatever Myung asked for, the young man didn't dare refuse. Myung could clearly see the current decline of the Mount Hua sect. No wealth, no martial arts techniques, no talented disciples, and the only thing Myung could possibly make use of was the human potential. Although not a single one of the current disciples was worth much, Myung believed that they could still improve. The main focus was probably that buzzcut guy Jo-gul. The disciples gathered early in front of the boarding house as Myung had requested. A few of them even seemed uncomfortable being ordered around by a mere newcomer. Seeing Myung calmly appear, those disciples who hadn't yet been beaten by Myung before started shouting and questioning him loudly. Myung gave a smile that couldn't have looked more harmless, as if he wasn't the slightest bit bothered by the disciples' criticism. He simply and gently invited the boys to step inside the room. Just a little heart-to-heart talk, that's all. After Myung herded all the disciples into the house, Jo-gul and the others standing outside were all breaking into a cold sweat. Because they could see the roof of the room trembling rhythmically. Whatever was going on inside must have been seriously intense. After giving the boys a thorough beating, Myung finally let them out. But this was only the beginning. From now on, he demanded that all disciples wake up early and train together with him. As dawn broke, the instructor was also awakened by the noise coming from the courtyard. The old man was a bit curious why were the brats up so early today. The uncle still remembered that when Myung first arrived here, he must have been very unfamiliar with everything. He figured it was best to get the kid into shape quickly with a good thrashing to set him straight. But when the steward uncle finally reached the training yard, he saw all the disciples dragging themselves here already. Each and every one of them was trembling uncontrollably. The warden noticed something strange was happening and anxiously shouted at the kids, "What's going on here?" But the warden quickly realized that the disciples all wore expressions of deep unease, their eyes nervously fixed on some spot. At first, the uncle thought buzzcut Jo-gul was bullying his fellow disciples, but that wasn't quite right. The kids were actually intimidated by the figure standing in front of Jo-gul. At that moment, Myung was practicing staff techniques using a wooden sword as a balance beam. He tied 2 large stones each twice the size of his body to either side. He worked diligently to perfect each final squat swap with precision. After letting out a deep breath, noticed the warden staring at him with eyes as if he were looking at a monster. The warden was indeed witnessing something truly horrifying. Looking at Myung's small, scrawny frame, it's barely any meat on his bones, but he was able to lift 2 massive stones with ease and still keep his footing steady. The warden hurriedly told the other boys to quickly bring some water. He is truly a thoughtful teacher. Myung was parched and dying of thirst. After letting Myung gulp down a couple of water to recharge, the warden finally demanded an explanation. Just what exactly had happened to leave all the disciples sprawled all over the courtyard like that? Myung waved his hand casually, signaling the instructor not to worry. He said it was just that from now on he and the other disciples would be waking up a bit earlier for morning exercise, that's all. It was just the first day, so they got a little carried away, trying to show their determination. The instructor glanced curiously at the group of disciples, only to see them frantically waving their arms and legs, desperately signaling their resistance. But the moment Myung gave them just a single sharp glance, they instantly shrank back in fear. The instructor was genuinely stunned. All the disciples of manhwa were terrified of a kid who had just joined the sect, as if he were a tiger. The warden felt he needed to knock some sense into Myung a bit. Thinking was doing, the instructor immediately brought out the sect rules to have a word with Myung. He felt that Myung taking it upon himself to cut into the disciples' sleep time and force them to train was absolutely unacceptable. Myung listened seriously. Then he immediately declared that he wouldn't do it again. Wait, the warden was actually expecting Myung to argue back so he'd have a reason to punish him. No, he had to find a different excuse. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he couldn't come up with any other valid reason. A disciple he had personally trained ended up getting beaten to a pulp so easily by some kid who had just arrived, it was just plain humiliating. Saying it out loud would only make him lose even more face. Right at that moment, Myung spoke up again. He asked for 1 month, then he would prove to the warden the results of pushing those disciples to their limits. Myung deliberately twisted the narrative, saying those disciples were full of determination, and those brats didn't dare step out of line either. The warden could clearly see that Myung had completely climbed on top of his senior brothers' heads and was riding them like a boss. Yet he wasn't abusing that power for anything unreasonable, he was just using it to push everyone to train properly within a strict structure. The warden was quite curious why exactly did Myung want to put everyone through such brutal training. He immediately got the answer: Myung wanted to speed up the process of mastering martial arts together with his fellow disciples. The warden then asked how Myung thought he should treat his senior brothers. He confidently replied that he was very obedient. Whatever his senior brothers taught, Myung always followed without question. The warden could see that Myung truly didn't have any malicious intent. In fact, his character was actually quite admirable too. He stepped forward. He looked at the group of disciples still lying sprawled all over the ground, and praised their self-motivated training spirit, telling them to keep it up and push even harder. The disciples hadn't even had the chance to cry out for help from the warden yet, but the warden had already vanished like the wind, slipping straight out the front gate of the training yard without a trace. These punks actually dared to beg the warden to save them. That was a blatant insult to Myung's dignity. He couldn't tolerate it any longer. Looks like he had no choice but to give his dear senior brothers another good round of beating. The foundational martial arts techniques of manhwa had either been lost or distorted. First of all, the bond between master and disciple had become far too superficial. Next, the character of the current elders was rather sloppy and questionable. This group of people are not even qualified to carry the shoes of elders from 100 years ago. Most of the current generation of disciples had entered the sect mainly through connections. But Myung was confident that it wasn't a problem without a solution. Because now Myung had returned to the manhwa sect. He will personally rebuild the #1 sect under heaven. Meanwhile, in the dining hall, the group of disciples had been tortured so cruelly that they couldn't even hold their chopsticks steadily to pick up food. One guy shouted at the top of his lungs, demanding Jogul step up. "Come on, Jogul, we're asking for just a little bit of principle here." Jogul calmly put down his chopsticks. Then he calmly reminded those brats that they were actually bossing around their senior brother. If you've got something to complain about, go complain yourself. Jogul had no interest in sitting around with those soft, doughy weaklings anymore. He called senior brother Yoonjong outside to have a quick word. Jogul asked Yoonjong how he felt about the current state of manhwa. Jogul had once seriously considered quitting and going the hell back home for peace of mind, but then he thought about the brotherhood he shared with the sect. Thinking about the colors and banner of manhwa made him hesitate. But when Myung showed up, it gave Jogul a completely different perspective. Even though he'd been forced by Myung to train until he was completely wrecked, but that was also the first time Jogul truly experienced what it felt like to train to the very limits of his endurance. Moreover, Myung trained alongside everyone. He never just stood around giving orders. In fact, he trained several times harder than anyone else. Jogul had found the true purpose of his life. It was to cultivate his skills to the highest level at manhwa, so that one day he could proudly face the world just like Myung. Yoonjong was a man of few words but deep emotions. He shared the same thoughts as Jogul. These two kids had no idea that Myung was lying on a tree branch not far away, overhearing everything. He quietly felt a bit accomplished for successfully enlightening his first 2 clueless disciples. Just as Myung was deep in thought about the next steps of his journey, he suddenly heard shouting outside. Someone was demanding to see the sect leader. The group kept yelling for a while, but no one came out to open the gate. Without any courtesy, they kicked down the main gate and stormed right in. Those guys were making a huge ruckus in the middle of the night like that. It was because they wanted the sect leader to repay his debt immediately. They'd allowed him to delay it for far too long already. Myung was once again completely shocked. The once legendary manhwa sect had now become a debtor hounded day and night by creditors. Was this really happening? The crowd swarmed like a festival, shouting and rushing to the front of the manhwa sect leader's room, demanding he come out and talk. They'd already come banging on his doorstep. At that point, the sect leader had no way to hide, even if he wanted to. He had no choice but to open the door and step outside. Even though he was clearly in a disadvantaged position right now, yet that sect leader still managed to radiate an air of calm and ease. Even Myung, secretly watching from a corner, couldn't help but feel a sense of admiration. At that moment, from the debt collector's side, stepped forward a plump man with a gentle smile on his face, politely greeting the sect leader. The sect leader also recognized the middle-aged man. He was known as Pavilion Master Gong. Pavilion Master Gong circled around with excuses, saying that he had originally planned not to come up to Mount Hua anymore. But unfortunately, those around him kept pleading so earnestly that he had no other choice. Pavilion Master Gong said that they truly wanted to sympathize with Mount Hua's difficult situation. However, Mount Hua had been in debt for far too long, and according to the contract, they were also supposed to pay interest. But Pavilion Master Gong added that since everyone here had once received kindness from Mount Hua, the interest could be reduced a bit out of friendship. After circling around the matter for a while, Pavilion Master Gong finally offered his solution that if Mount Hua couldn't afford to repay the debt, then they could just settle it by handing over some of the sect's buildings as collateral. Myung was stunned when he heard that. That also caused everyone to suddenly notice that he'd been eavesdropping there the whole time. After that, Myung returned to his room and called in Jo-gul, along with another fellow disciple, to ask them about the situation. Myung sat silently deep in thought. He wasn't sure if the main goal of those debt collectors was anything beyond just collecting money, so for now, he had no counterplan. As for the debt collectors, they were actually merchants living in the village right at the foot of Mount Hua. The fellow disciple didn't know much about the debt situation but mentioned that Mount Hua had entered the village at the foot of the mountain once again. However, he knew that Pavilion Master Gong was currently the owner of Taihua Tower. It was rumored that Taihua Tower was the most prosperous place around, where various bosses gathered to discuss business deals. Upon hearing this news, Myung was startled and wanted to verify the truth. But judging by Myung's current attitude, it seemed like he was about to punch someone. Myung truly felt everything had gone completely crazy. Taihua Tower was originally the property of Mount Hua. Myung grabbed the collar of the fellow disciple. He shouted loudly, wanting to confirm whether the person who had just led the debt collectors to Mount Hua was really the owner of Taihua Tower. Myung thought it over again and felt that something about this whole situation just didn't sit right. Why did Taihua Tower separate from Mount Hua, and now why was it turning around to make things difficult for Mount Hua? Myung turned to Jo-gul and ordered him to bring the supplies he had prepared earlier. It was a black outfit. Myung quickly stripped off the Mount Hua sect robes. Then he put on the black outfit, not forgetting to cover his face completely to make it easier to carry out his actions. Jo-gul glanced at Myung's current appearance and shivered, thinking, this little general is planning to pull off a whole round of sneaky moves, huh? Myung ignored Jo-gul and the others' worries. Quickly, he leapt up onto the roof. Then he swiftly leapt toward the marketplace at the foot of the mountain. Meanwhile, the creditors, having just successfully squeezed something out of the Mount Hua sect leader, were joyfully holding a celebratory feast. Thanks to Pavilion Lord Gong leading the charge, those merchants successfully confiscated even more of Mount Hua's gilded items. Pavilion Lord Gong subtly returned their courtesies, not forgetting to feign a hint of regret at having to pressure Mount Hua in such a way. With this display, Pavilion Lord Gong earned a rather good impression from the surrounding merchants. Not a single merchant there realized that Pavilion Lord Gong also harbored intentions concerning the Mount Hua sect. He wanted to slowly swallow Mount Hua whole. Swallow it whole in a truly elegant manner, just like the way he was carving the roast duck on the table. Some merchants were also curious why Pavilion Lord Gong wanted the Mount Hua sect leader to mortgage the sect's architecture to pay off debts. Pavilion Lord Gong simply explained that those halls and temples were a much better bargain than they appeared from the outside. He made the excuse that he could resell those buildings to Mount Hua's rival sects. By acting as an intermediary, he could earn a significant profit from the difference. As for the debt, Pavilion Lord Gong promised to repay the merchants in full. The merchants only cared about securing their own profits. Whether Pavilion Lord Gong had other schemes didn't matter to them. After a heavy drinking, a merchant ambled his way home, still calculating that as long as he collected enough money from Mount Hua, he wouldn't have to worry about food or clothes for the rest of his life. While he was stumbling drunkenly, this merchant suddenly saw a figure appear before him. The merchant tried hard to get a good look. He realized the other person was thoroughly concealing their face, almost like a street robber. Across from him, Myung also affirmed that he didn't care about robbing a few measly coins. He only needed the other party to obediently answer a few questions, and then he could let them go. The merchant confidently declared he wasn't interested in cooperating. At the same time, a group of guards suddenly appeared out of nowhere. To protect him closely, the merchant ordered his guards not to overdo it. Just take care of the opponent gently. As long as they can still open their mouth to speak, it's enough. The merchant then turned his back on Myung, claiming he disliked violence and preferred not to witness such scenes. However, the sounds of fighting behind him grew increasingly violent. It felt as if things were getting a bit out of hand. The merchant nervously turned his head back, scolding his subordinates and reminding them to go easy. To his surprise, when he turned back, he saw that all of his subordinates had already been beaten unconscious by Myung. Myung had clearly said to go easy, but they didn't listen, and made him use force anyway. Myung waved the merchant closer. Now it'll probably be easier to cooperate, right? But for the sin of not listening, they had to be taught a lesson first. Myung had to give that merchant a beating, at least enough, so that the opponent could only speak, before he continued with the interrogation. After being thoroughly beaten, the merchant was so bruised and battered that he was barely recognizable. He finally became a bit more cooperative. And even if he didn't want to cooperate, he couldn't refuse. After Myung interrogated him for a while, he learned that Mount Hua currently owed that merchant 100,000 gold taels, an incredibly massive sum. Myung pondered for a while before coming to a conclusion. Even if he sold that merchant off completely right now, it's not certain he'd gather 10,000 gold taels. So where did this guy get the nerve to lend Mount Hua so much money? The merchant, however, found this completely normal. All they needed to do was set usurious interest rates. The longer Mount Hua remained in debt, the more colossal the sum they'd have to shoulder. Myung saw the merchant grinning smugly as he talked about it. Unable to stand the sight of someone acting so confident without having full control, he immediately threw a punch straight at the merchant's head. Myung ignored whether the merchant was spitting blood or not. He remembered the man as Chu, the fabric shop owner in the village. So when did this old man acquire the fabric shop? Upon hearing Myung's question, the merchant froze for a moment, then corrected him, stating that the fabric shop had always belonged to his family and wasn't something he'd bought. Myung couldn't believe this. After all, the fabric shop in the village was originally Mount Hua's property, and all the major shops in Hua Yum village were established by Mount Hua itself. Originally, that place was dirt poor and undeveloped. Myung could imagine that when Mount Hua declined, the people entrusted with running those shops probably just conveniently swallowed up those businesses for themselves. The thought infuriated Myung. He had to give the merchant in front of him another beating. Just then, a voice shouted from behind, "Myung is just a cowardly sneak attacker. It's not playing fair." So Myung apologizes. Okay, he doesn't have much experience disguising himself as a robber. The man who had just spoken was one of the merchant's bodyguards. Just a moment ago, he had been thoroughly beaten by Myung. However, as soon as he regained consciousness, he confidently declared that he would defeat Myung. The man, feeling disrespected, was quite infuriated. He immediately drew his sword. Then, utilizing what he self-proclaimed as his top-tier movement technique, he charged towards Myung. Myung could see that the opponent's internal energy was greater than his own. Not to mention, his strength and speed were equally superior. In his current physical state, Myung couldn't overpower the opponent. But that wasn't a big deal. Myung kicked a sword lying near his foot, sending it flying precisely into his hand. Then he perfectly blocked the opponent's attack. With his current body, Myung was certainly weaker than the bodyguard. However, his advantage lay in the combat experience of the Plum Blossom Sword Saint. Lack of strength isn't an issue. Myung only needed to use the opponent's momentum to borrow their strength. Myung quickly took his stance. Then he glided forward, unleashing the Plum Blossom opening technique from the Plum Blossom sword art, easily sending the bodyguard to his defeat. Myung was just too engrossed in his performance and completely forgot one important thing. He forgot that the merchant was still kneeling not far away. If the merchant recognized the Mount Hua sword style, things would go south. The merchant at this moment was full of praise for the sword art Myung had just displayed. He even claimed to have caught a faint glimpse of divine aura. Myung broke out in a cold sweat. If the merchant could even recognize divine aura, did that mean he'd been exposed? The merchant continued to ramble on, letting his imagination soar. How on earth did he think Myung was a master of Zhongnan? Although his Mount Hua sword style was mistaken, but in this situation, Myung couldn't correct him. He had no choice but to go along with the merchant's vivid imagination. Meanwhile, atop Mount Hua, Jogul was still frantic with worry since Myung hadn't returned yet. Yunjong, standing nearby, advised him to calm down and not get agitated. Myung's no pushover after all. And just then, Myung opened the door and entered. His entire body was unscathed without a single scratch. Myung quickly stripped off his black attire and put his Mount Hua disciple uniform back on. He even gleefully boasted that he'd been royally welcomed and even given travel expenses. Thinking back to when the merchant mistook his identity, Myung felt both lucky and sad. The Mount Hua sword style was performed, yet people living near Mount Hua didn't even recognize it. That alone was enough to understand how much the sect had declined. Jogul was quite curious, wondering what information Myung had managed to extract. Myung flat out refused, declaring that kids should be less curious. You should spend your free time practicing instead. It's better. For Myung, no matter how harsh the conditions, the most important thing was never to interrupt his training. Upon hearing Myung's grand declaration, Jogul became very excited. He was about to pull Myung along, but Myung said no, claiming he was an exception because he had something more important to do today. Yunjong explained that without Myung, their training wouldn't be as effective. Well then, today we'll just focus on wellness exercises. Only Myung remained in the room. First, Myung began to organize the intelligence gathered today. The merchants have swallowed up all of Mount Hua's assets. It's probably because all the ledgers and documents were destroyed by the Devil's Worship sect when he caused havoc here. Otherwise, those wives wouldn't dare brazenly seize Mount Hua's assets like that. Myung thought he should just eliminate all those ungrateful merchants. But doing that would only cause public outrage. Myung needed a justifiable reason and a proper identity. Myung tossed and turned on the bed, racking his brain trying to think. Myung remembered that the sect leader elder brother was always secretly writing something in those notebooks. He guessed they might be hidden in a safe place. The trade ledgers must have definitely been backed up with multiple copies. Among those, there must be a copy hidden in the sect leader's secret vault. That's the only thing that makes sense. Myung also had a slight impression of the secret vault. It's highly probable that its entrance is located at the sect leader's residence. Myung once again tried to rack his brain thinking about which location was most likely to house the secret vault. It could only be buried inside the hill behind the sect. Myung once again tried to rack his brain thinking about which location was most likely to house the secret vault. So Myung couldn't wait and had to act right away. Myung promised himself that he was only trying to save manhwa. If he succeeded, he would hand everything over to the current sect leader. That's a big if, though. At the small mountain behind the sect leader's residence, a green light occasionally shone, accompanied by sounds of heavy breathing like a bellows being drawn. Myung was utterly exhausted and slumped to the ground. He grumbled that finding the hidden secret vault in the mountain was like looking for a needle in a haystack. He gathered inner energy into his palm. Then he transferred all of this inner energy into the ground. His goal was to use his inner energy to reach any empty spaces, and from there he could pinpoint the location of the secret vault. But once again, Myung chose the wrong spot. His inner energy was transmitted outwards for nothing. Even though he was exhausted, yet Myung knew he couldn't give up here. He moved to a different spot and repeated his search process. Surprisingly, this time he probed the correct energy flow, meaning he found the vault. No need to overthink it any further. Myung immediately grabbed the pickaxe he had brought along. He vigorously dug downwards. After all that wasted effort digging down tens of meters, Myung finally hit an area constructed with brick walls. He was a little confused. How could the place holding all of Mount Hwa's treasures be built with such simple bricks? Myung quickly pulled out a brick to examine it. It turned out the place he had dug into was a corridor leading to the storage room. Just then, footsteps echoed in the corridor. It turned out to be the current sect leader of Mount Hwa. He already knew about this secret vault. Myung secretly observed the sect leader walking straight to a door with intricate carvings, guessing that it was the entrance to the vault. However, the sect leader didn't push the door open and enter. He just stood before the strange door, trembling continuously. Myung could guess the sect leader's current state of mind. He must feel so helpless, unable to do anything. Mount Hwa has reached the brink of destruction. Having to shoulder the sect in its current state must make the sect leader utterly desperate. However, Myung also understood that the other person couldn't confide in anyone about these feelings. As the sect leader, he couldn't show that his own will was wavering. Myung just stayed put, waiting until dawn broke. The sect leader had also left, leaving Myung free to break through the corridor and enter. Myung was resolute, determined to open the door behind him at all costs. Only then could the current situation of Mount Hwa be turned around. He stepped forward and placed his hand on the door. Then he transferred a strand of inner energy into it. Unexpectedly, Myung's inner energy was quickly repelled. It seems things are getting a bit tricky to handle. The door before him, forged from 10,000-year cold iron and a span thick, was an incredibly strong secret chamber built with one of the hardest materials in the world. With this thing, even the foremost master might barely be able to open it. No wonder the current sect leader is helpless. Myung also feels powerless, and even his former sect leader elder brother couldn't forcefully break open this vault door. There must be a more proper way to open it. It was at this moment that Myung paid close attention to the strange patterns on the door. Upon closer inspection, it was clearly a trace created by swordplay, similar to the Plum Blossom swordplay. Myung had already deduced that if he could execute the martial arts techniques precisely following the traces left on the door, then he might be able to open the tough door in front of him. As for the execution method, Myung more or less had the ability to pull it off. However, there was one major problem. He didn't have enough strength. To execute the sword technique that could open that door required a fairly profound level of inner strength, something currently beyond Myung's reach. But then again, it wasn't entirely impossible. There was still one method left. A method that Myung absolutely didn't want to use, not even a little. Myung reached his hand toward his dantian. From that spot, a stream of pinkish-purple energy surged outward. Myung fused it with his current internal energy. Myung was now drawing upon his innate heavenly ki, a type of power that everyone possesses to sustain their very life force. Basically, that was life force itself. Myung was attempting to use his own life force to make up for the inner strength he lacked. From there, he unleashed the sword technique to open the door. Channeling his life force caused Myung's aura to grow exponentially more powerful. But along with that, he was already coughing up blood before he even finished the move. Myung didn't have many chances to try. He had to succeed on this very first attempt, no matter what. Even though every movement now had become many times more difficult, Myung still forced himself to maintain his willpower, compelling his body to execute his own sword technique. The wooden sword in Myung's hand, guided by his control, slowly began to perform each move of the Plum Blossom sword technique. The technique stretched on endlessly, one movement flowing into the next without pause. After completing a full round of the Plum Blossom sword technique, Myung could no longer hold himself steady. He dropped to his knees on the spot, coughing up several more mouthfuls of blood. The techniques Myung had just struggled to unleash were all completely absorbed by the intricate patterns on the door in front of him. Right after that, Myung sharply picked up on the sound of something heavy shifting. Then the thick iron door in front of him finally began to open, revealing a narrow gap. Seeing that, Myung was overjoyed. But when he moved a bit too suddenly, he ended up coughing up another mouthful of blood. In this condition, there was no way around it. Myung would have to lie in bed and rest until he recovered. It could say the price he paid was quite steep. Myung tried to regulate his breathing and calm his body. Then he prepared to enter the secret storage room, eager to see just what his sect leader's senior brother had hidden inside. Myung successfully stepped into the secret storage room. Looking around, he found that the place wasn't all that spacious, just a storage room with enough space for 3 bookshelves. In fact, the entire room was built from 10,000-year cold iron. Even though it was only this size, the cost to construct it must have been astronomical. Myung could now understand why his senior brother kept complaining all the time about being broke. Myung reached out for a random notebook on the shelf and flipped it open to take a look. After just skimming a few lines, Myung jumped up in shock because this was none other than the sect's financial ledger. Myung was certain that as long as he brought out these records, every single one of those merchants who dared to swallow manhwa's assets would be completely shut up. Myung only needed to glance at the title and see that it was related to the records of manhwa's assets. Without hesitation, he stuffed the entire ledger into his robe. After stuffing a bunch of ledgers into his robe, Myung finally began to wonder. Why hadn't he seen any gold, silver, or treasures in here? If he wanted to rebuild manhwa, then he'd need at least a bit of capital, right? Well, since there wasn't any, he had no choice but to accept his fate. Curious, Myung checked the remaining bookshelves to see what kinds of records they held. At a glance, it seemed like these were a few martial arts manuals. Actually, no. To be more precise, this place was actually storing the entire martial arts legacy of the manhwa sect. Myung could guess that his senior brother had been worried that one day if disaster struck manhwa, their martial arts might be lost forever. That's why he had copied all the secret manuals and hidden them here. On the 2 bookshelves here, Myung's senior brother had left behind all the resources needed to ensure that manhwa would never fall. Myung quietly told himself that with everything he had found in this room, he would definitely be able to rebuild a manhwa even greater and more prosperous than ever before. As for the 3rd bookshelf in this room, on it sat a single solitary scroll. It was a heartfelt letter from the sect leader. The former sect leader of manhwa, Myung's senior brother, had left behind a heartfelt letter addressed to all future sect leaders. According to the sect leader's belief, the ones who truly lead manhwa are not the sect leader himself but the disciples of manhwa. As for the sect leader, his greatest mission is to protect and guide the disciples of manhwa, helping them continuously grow and improve. Manhwa, whether in prosperity or decline, will always be manhwa. Yang Moon left behind this belief of his, hoping it could help the new sect leader find a clearer sense of direction. After carefully reading through all the notes left behind by his senior brother, then quietly told himself that, although he hadn't managed to score any cash from this place, he'd still made quite a fortune. At the very least, Myung had now secured the management ledgers, which meant the situation at manhwa was already on the path to salvation. Just as Myung was about to turn and leave, he suddenly sensed that something about this storage room wasn't quite right. Myung knew his senior brother like the back of his hand. The guy was basically an old man with OCD. Everything had to be perfectly symmetrical or he wouldn't be satisfied. And yet in this storage room, one entire side of the bookshelf was left completely empty, which didn't make any sense at all. Myung immediately turned back. Then he mustered all his strength and lifted the entire bookshelf to the side. Sure enough, beneath that bookshelf something had been hidden. A hidden underground chamber glowing brilliantly came into view before Myung's eyes. He quickly leapt down into the underground chamber. His eyes widened and his breathing grew noticeably heavier. What met Myung's eyes at that moment were stacks upon stacks of large gold bars piled high, and rows of finely preserved treasured swords neatly displayed on racks. There were also countless jewels and treasures laid out in the center of the room. Myung was about to lose his mind. If he could scoop up all this gold, silver, and treasure, he'd instantly become a rich tycoon right then and there. At the same time, over at the sect leader's private residence, he stood by the window. Watching the sunrise, his heart was filled with emotion. In just a few more days, the merchants would come knocking again to collect the debt, and he still hadn't come up with a solution. Just then, the warden came rushing up to the door shouting loudly. The old man had no idea how to even begin explaining what he had just witnessed. So the old man just asked the sect leader to follow him and see it for himself. That'd be much easier. The 2 of them quickly used lightness skill and soared out of the sect leader's residence. They headed toward the mountain behind. On the way, the sect leader noticed disciples lying sprawled all over the path and couldn't help but feel a bit curious. Ungum simply explained that the boys had recently become extra diligent with their training. Maybe just overdid it a little, that's all. Nothing for the sect leader to worry about. The sect leader was led by Ungum. They headed straight to where Myung was resting. But judging by the look of things, Myung probably hadn't had a moment's rest at all. At this moment, he looked no different than a haggard ghost. Myung said the sect leader didn't need to pay attention to him. Instead, he should look at what was beside him. Only upon closer look did he realize. Beside Myung was something shining brilliantly, a dazzling golden color. It made the sect leader's eyes widen in astonishment. Next to the tree root, there was a whole bundle of large gold bars and treasured swords tied together like a bundle of firewood, along with a stack of notebooks and other items. Myung made an excuse that he had accidentally discovered this stash, but now he was too exhausted and asked the sect leader for permission to rest first. The sect leader carefully inspected the stack of ledgers inside the box. It was clearly the ledgers recording the management of manhwa's shops. The sect leader had to try extremely hard to suppress his excitement and stop himself from immediately grabbing those ledgers. He was afraid that if he so much as touched them, the ledgers might crumble into dust, and that would be a complete disaster. In the end, he couldn't hold back. The sect leader carefully picked up one of the books to take a look. Then, overcome with excitement, he collapsed on the spot and fainted completely. When the sect leader finally regained consciousness, He had already been brought back to his room to rest. As for the items Myung had accidentally discovered, they had already been carefully brought back and secured. After that, the sect leader summoned the leader of the Finance and Economy Agency, Master Hyun Young. After studying them for a while, he excitedly confirmed that all those ledgers were absolutely the real deal. In those ledgers documenting manhwa's assets, there were even government-issued licenses and official seals from the authorities all properly included. With these documents, manhwa could immediately reclaim all of its assets from the merchants. This was an astonishing fortune. Hearing that, the sect leader let out a long sigh of relief. Suddenly he had a strange feeling that taking Myung in on a whim back then had truly been the right decision. Now that they had all the documents in hand, the sect leader immediately shouted for the merchant managing the shops down in Hwayam village to be summoned to report in. A few days later, the group of merchants came marching up Mount Hua one after another. Pavilion Master Gong, leading the group, did his best to rally everyone's spirits, saying, "Just hang in there, before you know it, the money will be in our pockets." The merchant who'd been beaten up by Myung last time was also among the group. He quietly told himself he had to hang in there. As long as he could get the money this time, he'd never have to set foot on this mountaintop again. He absolutely loathed this place by now. A few other merchants were a bit curious, wondering why the Mount Hua sect leader had summoned all of them at once. Could it be that he had finally scraped together enough money to pay off the debt? But Pavilion Master Gong firmly stated that there was no way the debt amounted to hundreds of thousands of gold taels, not some small sum. He figured the Mount Hua sect leader just wanted to ask for another extension on the debt. But the other merchants found this reasoning a bit strange. If he was coming to beg, shouldn't he at least show more sincerity? The merchant with the black eye suddenly had a thought. Could it be that Mount Hua was planning to default on the debt altogether? But even if they did default, there was no way Mount Hua could just run away and hide. When the group of merchants finally arrived at Mount Hua's main gate, most of them suddenly felt a wave of unease rising within. They were uneasy at the thought that this sect, which had maintained a friendship with them for hundreds of years, was now being pushed toward collapse by their own hands. And even if the merchants were to grant Mount Hua another extension now, the sect likely wouldn't last more than a few more days anyway. From inside, Unam stepped out to the main gate to welcome the group of merchants. He then politely invited everyone to come and meet with the sect leader. Once again, the sect leader stood face to face with everyone. Pavilion Master Gong, taking the lead, still said a few flowery words, it just to maintain a bit of courtesy and preserve appearances in front of Mount Hua's sect leader. But when the sect leader invited everyone in for a cup of tea to warm up the conversation, Pavilion Master Gong abruptly cut him off. He just wanted the Mount Hua sect leader to get straight to the point, no more beating around the bush. Seeing how eager Pavilion Master Gong was, the sect leader decided not to waste time either. He got straight to the point, saying that Mount Hua had managed to scrape together a loan. However, they still couldn't gather enough to fully repay the debt on time. Hearing those words, Pavilion Master Gong broke into a triumphant smile. He leisurely replied that the group of merchants had already allowed Mount Hua to defer the debt for far too long. They couldn't afford to drag it out any further. The sect leader responded, saying that Mount Hua could repay a portion of the debt first. So he was hoping a few of them would be willing to allow another extension this time. Everyone present suddenly felt the atmosphere growing increasingly strange. Myung sat casually perched on the wall, curious to see where all of this was heading. He couldn't understand why the sect leader was still trying to act polite and submissive in front of the merchants at a time like this. He wasn't sure if the sect leader was planning to hit the merchants with a devastating blow, or if he was offering a way out for those who still had a bit of sentiment left. One thing Myung could say for certain, this sect leader named Hyunjong was definitely not a simple man. As the sect leader, he had to keep a cool head. He needed to be able to weigh pros and cons carefully to manage the entire sect effectively. At that moment, Pavilion Master Gong spoke up again firmly, stating once more that the merchants could no longer make any concessions to Mount Hua. Sect leader Hyunjong once again cut him off mid-sentence. He clarified that he wasn't making a request to Gong alone, he was asking for the personal opinion of each individual merchant, to see if anyone among them was still willing to show Mount Hua a little grace. As for those who refused to extend the debt, Hyunjong didn't promise to repay them. Instead, he said that they had only managed to gather a portion of the repayment, so they should just relax for now. Sect leader Hyunjong further assured them that any merchant willing to support Mount Hua at this time would certainly be well rewarded later. The merchant with the bruised eye bluntly stated that honestly, Mount Hua's current situation didn't look good at all. Continuing to extend Mount Hua's debt basically meant risking a total loss of that money. Sect leader Hyunjong reaffirmed once more that the merchants could place their trust in the name of Mount Hua. Hearing that, Pavilion Master Gong burst out laughing. He said relying solely on the name of a sect to make promises wasn't nearly enough. Sect leader Hyunjong shot back. Was the name Mount Hua truly meaningless now? Who would dare to look down on the name of Mount Hua? Who would dare to disrespect its long history? Even though Mount Hua had fallen on hard times, its name and reputation still carried full weight. Pavilion Master Gong immediately stepped forward and declared that any merchant willing to extend Mount Hua's debt should step aside, and of course, anyone who dared to give Mount Hua more time would have to take full responsibility for that decision. If they got stiffed, they'd have to live with it. Hearing that the group of merchants truly began to worry deeply, Pavilion Master Gong was confident he had the upper hand for sure. Just as he was about to show attitude towards sect leader Hyunjong, someone suddenly stepped to the side. It was none other than Shopkeeper Yu, the man that Myung had punched with a black eye. Shopkeeper Yu firmly stated that he wasn't crazy. He pointed out that Pavilion Master Gong had married into the village from elsewhere, so there were many things he didn't understand, like how much Mount Hua meant to the people of Huayum Village. Every child raised in Huayum Village grew up with the belief that they should strive to join Mount Hua and bring glory to its name. Shopkeeper Yu was no exception to that. However, his talent was limited, so he had to give up on that dream. But he still clearly understood everything Mount Hua had sacrificed to protect Huayum Village and the world. The other merchants could take their money and disappear to live carefree lives somewhere far away. But Shopkeeper Yu was born and raised here. He had lived his whole life in this place and had nowhere else to go. Right now, even Shopkeeper Yu thought he must be crazy gambling such a large sum of money to stand with Mount Hua at a time like this. But Shopkeeper Yu could confidently say that he wasn't exactly struggling. Even if he lost the money Mount Hua owed him, it wouldn't make him poor. But if he chose to turn his back on Mount Hua now, Shopkeeper Yu knew he'd be haunted by guilt for the rest of his life. Pavilion Master Gong didn't bother saying anything more. After all, it was just Shopkeeper Yu alone. What difference could he possibly make? But to his surprise, 4 more merchants stepped forward to stand beside Shopkeeper Yu. Sect leader Hyunjong looked at the merchants who still had a shred of conscience, let out a quiet sigh. All he really wanted was to see if there was still anyone who held Mount Hua in their heart. Now that the confirmation was done, the sect leader gave the order for Unam to bring out the items, and Unam obeyed immediately. He carried out a wooden box filled with ledgers and placed it right in front of the group of merchants. There were the very ledgers proving Mount Hua's ownership of properties in Huayum Village. As for the group of merchants pressing the matter under Pavilion Master Gong's lead, sect leader Hyunjong ordered an immediate confiscation of their assets. At the same time, he also declared Mount Hua would reclaim all profits those merchants had earned from using the sect's properties. The merchants siding with Pavilion Master Gong were shocked and cried out in alarm. They never expected sect leader Hyunjong to act so ruthlessly. Off to the side, Pavilion Master Gong kept scrutinizing the ledgers that had been brought out, then accused sect leader Hyunjong of joking. He claiming that there was no guarantee those records were even real. Those words were rather insulting. Was he implying that Mount Hua would stoop to making baseless claims and fabrications? Pavilion Master Gong couldn't afford to escalate things that far. He quickly backpedaled, making the excuse that perhaps Mount Hua had been deceived, that the ledgers might be forgeries after all. Seeing how stubborn the other party was, the sect leader ordered Pavilion Master Hyunyoung of the Records Hall to come and testify. When Hyunyoung appeared, he agreed that the authenticity of the ledgers did indeed need to be verified. This gave the merchants a lifeline to cling to, and they immediately began chiming in support of Hyunyoung. But these people were clearly daydreaming in broad daylight. Hyunyoung had long anticipated this situation, so he had already sent half of the ledgers to the local authorities for verification beforehand. Upon hearing that, Pavilion Master Gong immediately realized he had walked right into a trap. By now, while the merchants were still gathered here, the authorities had surely already dispatched soldiers to take control of all business properties in Huayum. Sect leader Hyunjong had planned everything. There was no way he'd invite the merchants for a peaceful discussion. Pavilion Master Gong still stubbornly refused to give up. He clung to the hope that maybe the ledgers had already expired or were no longer valid. Pavilion Master Gong was about to raise his voice and confront sect leader Hyunjong directly. But the sect leader's voice thundered even louder, completely overpowering him. To those who stabbed Mount Hua in the back during its time of hardship, Hyunjong would show absolutely no mercy. He declared that all their assets would be confiscated. However, he would allow each shop owner to take 1 cart of goods with theme as a form of compensation for their years of hard work in business. Pavilion Master Gong was burning with rage more bitter than swallowing hot pepper, but he had been utterly defeated. There was no way to turn the tables now. All he could do was leave behind a parting threat and turn to walk away. As for the merchants who chose to hold on to some shred of loyalty to Mount Hua, although the sect would still reclaim all ownership of the assets, the sect leader would allow them to continue running their businesses, as long as they submitted the agreed share of profits. Shopkeeper Yu felt that this outcome was still better than what the other merchants faced. However, going from being his own boss to working under someone else still left him with a slight sense of loss. At that moment, Myung overheard sect leader Hyunjong's decision and couldn't accept it at all. How could those ungrateful merchants be allowed to take away a whole cart of wealth after what they did? In his eyes, everything should have been confiscated, no exceptions. The group of merchants led by head shopkeeper Gong gloomily dragged along a cart loaded with their belongings, slowly made their way down the road. They had just descended the mountain when their businesses were already sealed off by the authorities. All of this happened because we followed Pavilion Master Gong's arrangements. A merchant spoke up questioning how that old Gong planned to handle the situation. Pavilion Master Gong felt irritated when the other party dared to question him. He firmly stated that all of them were only temporarily retreating. He still insisted that those account books were merely fakes. The merchants felt something wasn't right, and they had already looked through the account books, and the authorities had verified them as well. Pavilion Master Gong claimed that Mount Hua had bribed the district magistrate. Now these people just needed to temporarily take shelter somewhere else. After that, they just needed to rely on the power of a stronger force and fight their way back. Right at that moment, a small figure appeared in front of the convoy. Face hidden under a black outfit, who else could it be but Myung? Pavilion Master Gong observed the other person and felt something was off. In broad daylight, trying to rob a convoy alone and looking all hunched like that. Is it a old or just a kid? Pavilion Master Gong didn't give a damn who the other person was. He just wanted Myung to stay away from their property. Hearing that, Myung got pissed. That was his property, okay? Don't talk nonsense. Wasn't that basically admitting defeat before the fight even began? Old Gong could immediately confirm the other person was from manhwa. He couldn't make a move directly on manhwa's grounds, but here he could do whatever he wanted. He snapped his fingers once. Immediately, a group of guards dressed in all black leapt out from the forest. Radiating murderous intent, they charged straight toward Myung. Facing these little chicks, Myung wasn't the least bit flustered. He leapt up, grabbed the hilt of his sword, and used the very hilt to knock each guard on the head. After a series of smooth, effortless moves, Myung had taken down the entire group of guards without missing a single hit. Myung kindly reminded them that underestimating his words was a big mistake. No one had ever disrespected him, and walked away in one piece. Pavilion Master Gong broke out in a cold sweat. He hadn't expected manhwa to still be hiding such a powerful expert. He couldn't understand why Myung had to hide his identity. But if that guy had stepped up to intimidate everyone from the start, manhwa wouldn't have fallen into such a declining state like it had now. Pavilion Master Gong suddenly came up with an idea. He wanted to take Myung out right here and now. Losing a top fighter like Myung would surely break Master Hyunjong's heart. Clearly that old Gong wasn't just some ordinary guy, he was also a martial artist with inner strength. Facing old Gong, Myung had already anticipated this long ago. He took the sword off his belt, slung it over his shoulder, and assured that he'd try his best not to physically damage old Gong's mouth. Only that way could the other guy still keep talking right. Pavilion Master Gong struck with full force, creating a loud shockwave that shook the entire corner of the forest. The spot where he landed had been smashed into a huge crater. Pavilion Master Gong knew Myung was no ordinary opponent. After all, he had taken down all his subordinates in the blink of an eye, so he had focused all his strength. But at this moment, Myung was completely fired up instead. Facing Pavilion Master Gong, who was raging like a wild beast, Myung instead showed a pair of eyes and an attitude utterly indifferent. And no wonder he was indifferent after all. That old Gong wasn't on the same level as Myung. Watching him charge forward desperately, Myung didn't even bother to draw his sword from its sheath. He left the sword sheathed, then precisely thrust it into the opponent's fist. Pavilion Master Gong was stunned right on the spot. Immediately after, the inner energy accumulating in his arm backfired. It recoiled violently, causing him to injure his entire arm. Myung advised that everything should stop right here. But the Tower Master's attack is too slow. There is no sense of challenge at all if this keeps going. The Tower Master should be ready to say goodbye to his arms. Better step back now. The Tower Master was so enraged that his blood boiled. He gathered all his inner strength into his legs. Then he launched a powerful kick. The energy from the kick burst outward and pierced through Myung. Then it tore up the entire stretch of road behind, but the Tower Master didn't realize that he hadn't actually landed a hit on Myung. Myung instantly teleported behind the Tower Master, and in that very moment, the Tower Master felt a chill down his spine. He immediately swung his arm to attack, but Myung used the sword in his hand to tap the Tower Master's other arm, causing the Tower Master to officially lose both arms. The Tower Master was utterly bewildered, because clearly Myung was not fast enough to be impossible to follow, and not stronger than him either. If judged based on appearance alone, then the Tower Master could easily handle even 10 people like Myung. But no matter how viciously the Tower Master wanted to attack, he still could not even touch the hem of Myung's clothes, let alone his body. Myung moved with absolute precision without a single wasted motion. He even had the leisure to reach out and pick his nose. Myung could read all of the Tower Master's movements. This was no longer a challenge, but simply tormenting the ones ranked at the bottom. Myung straightened his body and stood upright again. He felt the game had become boring. It was time to deal with the Tower Master. Cold sweat dripped from the Tower Master's face. He truly couldn't understand why a master like Myung had been hiding all this time without stepping out to save Flowery Mountain. Myung felt that his opponent was clearly overestimating his own strength. Since the Tower Master asked, Myung had to give him an answer. Myung felt that the Tower Master's identity was actually far more worth being curious about. A Tower Master who actually had some decent fighting skills, Myung admitted that even if the Tower Master didn't take this position with his strength, there would be no shortage of ways for him to make money. But Myung already knew exactly what the Tower Master was about to say. Probably something like he has no hidden agenda and isn't taking orders from anyone, right? Those cliché villain lines from small fries like him. Myung was already way too familiar with them. The real issue Myung needed to focus on was extracting all the information from the Tower Master. And for him, there was no method more effective than physical force. Myung didn't expect the Tower Master to reveal any useful information anyway. He just needed to completely beat this old man to pieces. That alone was enough to satisfy him. Myung took the initiative and charged forward. From the angle, it was clear he intended to strike at the Tower Master's knee. The Tower Master thought so too, but right when he believed there was no way to dodge, Myung suddenly attacked straight at the Tower Master's shoulder. The Tower Master was overwhelmed with pain that pierced his heart and utterly confused in the head. It was clear that Myung had aimed for the knee, so how the hell did he end up attacking the Tower Master's shoulder? Without giving the Tower Master any time to think, Myung immediately launched another wave of attacks. This time it looked like he was about to strike directly at the opponent's head. The Tower Master instinctively raised his hand to shield the top of his head, but he had made a mistake. Myung's true intention was to stab straight into the Tower Master's throat. The Tower Master was struck so hard that his head was spinning. It was clear that he could see every attack path, yet he still couldn't defend against a single strike. After that, the Tower Master just stood there with a dumbfounded face, letting Myung beat him up continuously. Looking into Myung's indifferent and cold eyes, the Tower Master could be certain these were the eyes of someone who had taken countless lives. Myung had now become more serious. He had decided to draw his sword and slowly advance toward his opponent. The Tower Master saw Myung raise his sword high, preparing to strike down his face, turning pale, without a drop of blood left. Suddenly, a massive palm strike blasted straight up into the sky. That palm strike was unleashed by the Tower Master himself, and through that palm strike technique, Myung immediately recognized that the technique the opponent had just used was Tai Yi Divine Skill. Myung was truly annoyed now, never expecting that this old man was from the Zhongnan sect. Myung found it quite an interesting coincidence that the mastermind behind pushing Flowery Mountain into debt was actually someone skilled in the martial arts of the Zhongnan sect. The Tower Master was now filled with regret, wanting to bang his head against the wall. He should never have revealed the Tai Yi Divine Skill, even if the sword was held to his throat, especially since his opponent was from the Flowery Mountain sect. It was also because at that moment, Myung fiercely slashed down with his sword, causing the Tower Master to panic and make a wrong move. When Myung saw the Tower Master biting his lip in silence, he thought his opponent had made a wise choice. After all, the more you talk, the more you slip up. The Zhongnan sect has never been an ordinary school. Since long ago, the Zhongnan sect and Flowery Mountain have had a mutual rivalry. It must be acknowledged that the Zhongnan sect is also one of the top sects in the world, only then could it be on par with Flowery Mountain. Myung couldn't just get tense, simply because the Tower Master showed the martial arts of the Zhongnan sect. He began to play the psychological game, complaining that it was all because of some petty conflicts from the past. But now, the Zhongnan sect uses economic warfare against its enemies. How far has the martial spirit gone? The Tower Master pondered silently for a moment. Then he said that actually, this was also good for Flowery Mountain. According to the old man, from what he saw, the Flowery Mountain sect had lost hope a long time ago. A sect that has lost its martial arts legacy has no chance of regaining its former glory. The Tower Master merely accelerated the collapse of the Flowery Mountain sect a little faster. When Myung heard the other person say that, he demanded, "If you've got the guts, say it one more time." Daring to say that the Flowery Mountain sect has lost its roots, Myung said, "Do you believe that I will slash my sword straight into your head right here and now?" Looking back, Myung had actually beaten quite a few disciples from the Zhongnan sect. The family principles and philosophy of the Zhongnan sect and the Flowery Mountain sect were quite similar, and since both sects specialized in swordsmanship, they often held friendly matches to showcase the skills of their disciples. At that moment, the old man shouted at the top of his lungs, trying to defend himself, claiming he wasn't someone from Zhongnan. Myung was almost convinced the way you said it sounded like me wasn't from the Flowery Mountain sect either. Back to the matter at hand, Myung raised the old man's chin with the tip of his sword and said he would let him witness something. If the other person could understand it, then it would surely be quite interesting. Myung reminded the Tower Master to deliver precisely what he was about to demonstrate to the one standing behind that old man. Then, under the astonished gaze of the Tower Master, the sword in Myung's hand began moving at a terrifying speed. It drew out countless afterimages. The old man could only sense that Myung's sword was unbelievably fast. Just by swinging it in place, he could stir up a fierce gust of wind, while the old man was still trying to figure out what Myung was trying to do. Myung had already finished his sword technique, and had already slipped behind the old man without him even noticing. Right after that, a soft pink light appeared before the old man's eyes. The old man instinctively tilted his head up toward the sky, and immediately saw an entire sky filled with falling petals drifting in the wind. The more the old man looked, the more he felt that there was something not quite right about this shower of petals. It was clearly the manifestation of a supreme technique. A supreme technique from the plum blossom swordsmanship. The sky full of falling petals gathered into a pillar of light, striking directly down at the spot where the old man was standing, causing him to collapse on the spot instantly. As for Myung, after unleashing that ultimate move, he also coughed up a small mouthful of blood. His body was already weakened, and yet he still performed a supreme technique. Then how his body could endure that? If it were during his prime, that move would have been just a few casual swings for Myung, but now he had to muster every bit of his inner strength just to barely pull it off. Myung pulled his mask back into place, then turned his head and called out toward the back. He called out to the remaining merchants who were hiding behind the trees, telling them to come out and talk. Myung asked, "Which one of you tough guys wants to get beaten up before I let you go?" Of course, no one dared to make a sound. When Myung asked who wanted to be let go right away, the merchants instantly perked up and without a moment of hesitation, scrambled to flee together. Myung actually appreciated the sense of unity among that group. However, he had never actually agreed to let them leave just like that. If Myung simply let these goods slip away like that, then what was he supposed to do with the pile of goods left behind here? Myung ordered each merchant to take inventory of the belongings they had brought, then honestly report everything to him. After that, Myung instructed the merchants to quickly bring the carts of goods to the nearest estate. Sell off everything, convert it all into cash, and don't forget to bring back the receipts. If anyone dares to forge them, they won't get away with it. Then Myung won't let it slide. One merchant foolishly asked what if some of them happened to run away. Myung felt there was no point in them running away. All their remaining assets were still here. If they wanted to get even a bit of money back as compensation for their losses, they'd better know their place. As for whether they would report this to the authorities, Myung didn't answer. Instead, he simply stomped hard on the ground with all his strength. A shockwave spread through the ground, blowing the merchant's hair wildly in the air. If these merchants wanted to report to the authorities, that was fine, but after that, they'd better hide well and make sure Myung never finds them, or he'd show them exactly what living hell on earth feels like. The merchants shrank back in fear. Then who would even dare to have any reckless thoughts after that? After that, Myung was overflowing with joy as he hugged a thick stack of freshly printed banknotes, leisurely making his way back to the peak of Flowery Mountain Sect. Then gracefully leapt over the wall and landed inside the courtyard. Inside the Flowery Mountain Sect, Jogul and the group of disciples were resting by the riverside. They were shaking out their clothes after they had been soaked with sweat from intense training, although the other disciples kept complaining about why they had to train so harshly. But Jogul, on the other hand, felt that this was something wonderful. All the brothers had undergone physical transformation. It was truly a beautiful sight. Yoonjong came over to ask what Jogul was smiling about. Jogul had to admit that till now, he was only now able to truly see the spirit of martial arts in everyone. Jogul even thought that he himself had been having some rather strange thoughts, because all this time, everyone had simply been training martial arts together. But Yoonjong shared the same view as Jogul. Indeed, the Flowery Mountain Sect has clearly undergone a significant change now. Just a few days ago, sweating during training was almost unthinkable for the group of disciples. At first, they all thought they would come to Flowery Mountain Sect to practice some health exercises for a while, and then ask to go back down the mountain home. But ever since Myung appeared, everything has changed. Jogul could feel a new breeze blowing through the Flowery Mountain Sect. He just didn't know whether it was only a passing breeze or if this wind would gather strength and become a raging storm. When the group of disciples returned to the mountain peak, they heard countless sounds of commotion coming from afar. At the sect's entrance, people were coming and going in large numbers, carrying all kinds of materials, constantly moving into the Flowery Mountain Sect. The disciples walked in, looking around in confusion. They immediately saw the supervisor standing in the middle of the courtyard, continuously directing people in and out and coordinating the transport of materials. Yoonjong then stepped forward on behalf of the brothers to ask what exactly had happened. The supervisor did not give a clear explanation. He only affirmed that this time the Flowery Mountain Sect would undergo a spectacular transformation. Currently, the palaces and architecture of the Flowery Mountain Sect have all become too old, so they have no choice but to renovate. The disciples weren't idle either. The supervisor immediately ordered the merchants to roll up their sleeves and lend a hand. Help out and give it your all, of course. By evening, the disciples once again stared in amazement when tonight's meal even included roasted chicken. The whole group thought they must be dreaming. Tonight's meal even had meat, and the kids were over the moon. They had been at Flowery Mountain Sect for quite a while, but this was the first time they saw such a complete meal. Things were changing too quickly. The palace was suddenly renovated, and the meal now included meat. Then each disciple was also given 2 new sets of uniforms. Jogul and Yoonjong walked together, both feeling that having money was truly enjoyable. Flowery Mountain Sect had gone through an incredibly difficult period, and now it was suddenly undergoing a powerful transformation. It was only natural that the disciples were momentarily overwhelmed and confused. Even the supervisor, who was rumored to always have a stern face, was now grinning from ear to ear. Flowery Mountain Sect was changing, and the disciples needed to adapt as quickly as possible. Not to adapt to a life of comfort and abundance, but to train their bodies well enough to be qualified for further learning. Those newly introduced cultivation techniques, those were the real goal. Previously, Myung had put on the most ridiculously childish act when he revealed that pile of resources and techniques. Jogul and Yoonjong couldn't figure out what Myung's intention was. However, one thing was certain, that their opponent was rapidly making the Flowery Mountain Sect better. Jogul and Yoonjong had to work even harder. They didn't want to let down Myung, who was doing his best to create opportunities for everyone. Speaking of Myung, Jogul was quite curious about where that guy had gone, but this was something Yoonjong actually knew. Myung was being summoned by the sect leader. At that moment, in the sect leader's private residence, Yoonjong declared that the person who had contributed the most in bringing about the transformation of Flowery Mountain Sect was Myung, and he must be handsomely rewarded. Sect leader. Yoonjong was very eager to know what kind of reward Myung desired at this moment. Myung had offered the sect a massive bundle of gold bars without hesitation or deceit. If he needed money, Yoonjong was more than willing to reward him with a deserving share. Myung thought for a moment and then decisively declined. Upon hearing that, Yoonjong almost thought Myung was some kind of sage, as if money was just fleeting dust to him, something he paid no mind to. Exactly, treating money as if it were fleeting and meaningless. But the old man was mistaken. It wasn't that Myung didn't care about money, it was just that he had already earned so much that a little reward wasn't even worth stuffing between his teeth. Yoonjong then offered a different reward, asking if Myung wanted priority access to the new cultivation techniques. But Myung turned that down as well. He excused himself by saying that cultivation techniques should be practiced step by step, from basic to advanced, in order to be effective. In reality, it was probably Myung who should be teaching the techniques to the sect leader instead. There were still many techniques that Myung needed to pass on to the sect leader, and he had to keep coming up with reasonable excuses to do so. If we were to ask what Myung truly needed from the Flowery Mountain Sect at this moment, then honestly it would be a difficult question to answer. Suddenly Myung thought of something. He wanted to request the freedom to go down to Hua Yum whenever he needed. Myung needed that kind of freedom of movement to be able to pull off more of his plans. Myung used the excuse of needing real-world experience for training, and Yoonjong could understand that. However, doing so would go against the rules of the Flowery Mountain Sect. If Myung were granted the special privilege of free movement, it might cause dissatisfaction among the other disciples. Since the request for free movement was denied, Myung decided to make a different proposal. He said that his physical condition at the moment wasn't good at all, and he'd heard rumors that spiritual elixirs were excellent for restoring one's vital energy. All in all, Myung just wanted to coax a few spiritual elixirs out of the sect leader for his own enjoyment. After clearly hearing Myung's request, sect leader Hyun-jong made his decision. With the authority of the leader of the Flowery Mountain sect, he granted Myung the permission to go down to Hwa-Yum freely whenever he wished. He didn't let Myung voice any objections or complaints. The sect leader firmly finalized his decision. That's final end of discussion. Then he promptly kicked Myung out of the room. Myung suddenly thrown out like that was left fuming in frustration. Inside, he was screaming furiously, demanding that the old man Hyun-jong hand over the spiritual elixirs already. But this really put sect leader Hyun-jong in a tough spot. He didn't even have any spiritual elixirs to give as a reward. After successfully kicking Myung out of the room, sect leader Hyun-jong turned back inside and asked the other supervisors what they thought about this kid. Supervisor Un-am immediately affirmed that Myung was truly a rare genius. He was extremely talented and intelligent, although there were still some things he hadn't fully grasped. But considering Myung's current age, he was already far ahead of his peers. Un-am was especially impressed by Myung's demeanor when speaking. The kid was never whiny like ordinary children. On the contrary, he made Un-am feel a strangely mature aura. The sect leader then asked for the opinion of another supervisor, Hyun-sang. Even if this uncle wasn't very good at reading people, at least he should have some sense, right? Hyun-sang didn't know how to explain it. He could only say that Myung was no ordinary child. He didn't know whether Myung's past life had been too harsh or not. That had caused the kid to mature far beyond his years. Hyun-sang even suspected that Myung might actually be an old man trapped in a child's body. Hyun-jong carefully listened to everyone's opinions. It seemed that Myung was displaying a demeanor unlike that of a child. But in the end, that was really just how his appearance was. Hyun-jong believed that if Myung was already a talent, then the Flowery Mountain sect must take even greater responsibility to guide Myung and help him develop as best as possible. Sect leader Hyun-jong temporarily put this matter aside. He then asked Un-am about the progress of the sect's reconstruction. Un-am had been pushing the progress forward as quickly as possible. He even allowed people to cut down large trees on the mountain to quickly gather enough materials. But it couldn't be sped up any further. Sect leader Hyun-jong suddenly asked. He asked whether his fellow disciples felt he had made an overly ambitious decision by wanting to immediately rebuild the sect. He believed that if Flowery Mountain sect wanted to be reborn again, then it is necessary to start by properly refining the appearance. Only then can the image quickly spread throughout the martial arts world. Of course, quality cannot be overlooked either. All the newly recovered martial arts were entrusted to Hyun-sang for verification and to be passed down to the disciples. This task requires an extremely high level of meticulousness, so there's no need to rush. To be honest, deep down, Hyun-sang still had some concerns about that pile of techniques. The lost cultivation techniques of Flowery Mountain sect were suddenly discovered as if someone was orchestrating a secret plan. However, Hyun-sang could confidently affirm that those techniques were completely authentic and had no issues. Surely that mysterious person only wanted to help Flowery Mountain sect. Meanwhile, outside, Myung was fuming because he didn't even get a single spiritual elixir as a reward. He had painstakingly sat down and copied each and every technique by hand. And Myung could confidently say that Flowery Mountain sect wasn't just poor. They had even lost the method of pill refinement. Just one look at the sect leader's face back then was enough to tell. Right now, Myung's body was screaming from being overloaded. The backlash from using his life force was far too severe. If he didn't get any spiritual elixirs to replenish himself, soon Myung might end up bedridden and recovering for half a year. This wasn't a good thing at all because a child's body grows and changes rapidly. It was the golden period for cultivating inner strength missing. It would be a real shame. If Myung wanted to recover his body quickly, there were only two ways. Either he had to eat spiritual elixirs like candy, or have a master transfer inner energy to him. The problem was finding such a master willing to help right now was like looking for a needle in a haystack. If it were the Flowery Mountain sect of the past, Myung would just need to spout a few flashy words and he'd be handed a whole bunch of spiritual elixirs to snack on. They even used to pop them like candy just to cure hangovers. Speaking of alcohol, this little booze-loving Myung suddenly started craving it again. And just like that, he suddenly remembered something related to it. Myung then thought of a place that might actually have some spiritual elixirs. Without wasting a second, Myung dashed off at full speed. Silently, he thanked the bad habits of his past life. They were now his saving grace in this one. Myung ran straight toward the Heartbreak Pavilion. It was the steepest and most treacherous cliff in the entire Flowery Mountain sect. This place held a natural cave nestled within the cliffside, and only Myung knew about it. The terrain was far too dangerous, so no disciples were ever allowed to train there. As a result, it became Myung's secret hideout whenever he wanted to escape from his senior brothers. Myung used to skip training and indulge in eating meat, drinking wine, and sleeping in as much as he wanted right here. Thinking back, Myung figured that the sect leader and senior brothers probably knew about this place all along, and they just chose to cover for him. Setting that aside, Myung was certain that there would be spiritual elixirs in that cave for him to use. If those spiritual elixirs had lasted more than 100 years, they must be of exceptional quality. If it were the peak era Myung, he could have reached the cave with just 2 light leaps, but with his current body that was simply impossible. If climbing up wasn't an option, then the only choice left was to lower himself down from the top of the cliff. It wasn't that dangerous and worst-case scenario he'd just end up on someone's altar, that's all. To save Flowery Mountain Sect, Myung really had to bend over backwards, literally. Heartbreak Pavilion was forbidden for training not just because of its height, so he decided to personally eliminate that uncertainty by creating opportunities for Mount Hua's growth with his own hands. Lord Huang was extremely pleased with this display from his son. Meanwhile, Myung was lounging comfortably on the steps, legs crossed, thinking back on Lord Huang's promise to grant him whatever he wanted. Honestly, Myung wasn't too hung up on it. If he gained something, great. If not, he'd just head back. He had lived long enough not to fuss over a bit of gain or loss. Right at that moment, Songbak approached Myung with a serious expression. He extended a wooden sword toward him, assuring that he meant no harm. He simply wished to have a proper honorable duel with Myung. It just gave his spine a bit of a jolt, that's all. Myung was yanked backward, and his body slammed into the cliffside. To avoid getting completely bruised and battered from crashing straight into the rock, he quickly activated the absorption art technique. He turned his hands into suction pads, absorbing the impact force from slamming into the cliff. But of course, nothing ever went smoothly. One of Myung's arms couldn't handle the strain and ended up with a cracked bone. Myung seriously wanted to curse out loud, as this fragile, useless, pathetic body of his was absolutely good for nothing. At the very least, Myung had successfully made it down near the cave's entrance. He was still a short distance away from the cave, and Myung had no choice but to stop using the absorption art technique. He then began to swing himself to build momentum and launch toward the cave. Just as Myung calculated that he had built up enough momentum and was ready to make a perfect leap, the rope suddenly snapped in half. It had worn through from too much friction against the cliffside. The situation turned critical in an instant. In the face of danger, Myung urgently reactivated the absorption art technique, desperately trying to cling to the steep cliff. Unluckily, the boy's hand couldn't withstand the intense pressure. It was already showing signs of fracturing. Just when Myung thought he was about to receive a one-way ticket straight to heaven, the rope suddenly got caught on a protruding rock ledge, saving Myung from what was clearly a losing hand. The kid used up every last ounce of strength he had left and climbed up into the cave. He couldn't help but curse under his breath. That Plum Blossom Venerable was a lunatic. What kind of madman would choose a place this dangerous for a hideout? Then it hit him. Maybe he'd knocked his head on rocks a few too many times, because wasn't the Plum Blossom Venerable none other than himself? Myung dragged his battered body into the cave. He yanked away the black cloth hidden in the corner of the cave. A simple yet well-lit living space quickly appeared before his eyes. In this cave, Myung had placed a giant night-bright pearl the size of a ball during his previous life, so lighting was never a concern. He quickly opened the wooden chest tucked away in the corner of the cave. Inside, besides several jars of century-old wine, there was also a small mirror. Finally, Myung achieved his goal of risking everything to come. Here is the wooden chest, contained the spiritual pills he had prepared to cure his hangover. The moment he opened the chest, a peaceful aura, like thousands of plum blossoms blooming all at once, it gently blew onto his face. Inside the wooden chest, besides the plum blossom pills piled up there, were also 5 iron plum pills worth 1,000 times more than the plum blossom pills. Myung couldn't help but curse the Plum Blossom Venerable again. What a lunatic to pile up such precious spiritual pills like this. Luckily, this heap of pills hadn't turned to dust yet. Myung hoped his late senior sect leader wouldn't scold him, because after all, he didn't hoard any rarer pills than these either. Right now, Myung urgently needs to heal his wounds, and must also seize the chance to cultivate some internal energy. He decided to take 1 iron plum pill first, then figure things out. The pill immediately dissolved as soon as it touched his tongue. A massive surge of spiritual energy instantly flooded Myung's body. Myung had no mind to savor the flavor of that precious pill. First, he needed to control the vital energy as the iron plum pill began to disperse and flow out of his body. Another problem arose. Even though the iron plum pill's medicinal power was incredibly strong, the vital energy was still not pure enough. Myung needed to purify it again to properly nourish his body. Myung decided to let go of most of the vital energy, only retaining the purest part. Myung tried to refine and extract only the purest part of the inner energy, then directed it deep into the dantian, seeking the location of the innate key, then mended its torn parts. Along with Myung's actions, a tremendous surge of internal power erupted and surged in all directions. Lifting Myung's body into the air, the tremendous surge of internal power was suddenly replenished, causing Myung's entire body to glow brightly. Along with it came an unbearable wave of pain. The stream of inner energy rampaged freely through Myung's body, then quickly began to regenerate the wounds he was enduring. Not only that, after being regenerated, the broken bones became several times stronger than before. Then Myung's gaunt face was also filled out once more, restoring the naturally smooth and radiant face he once had. In addition, the lingering impurities in Myung's body were also expelled. His chest and blood vessels were also expanded. But wait a moment, Myung suddenly felt that his heartbeat seemed a bit too fast. The moment that uneasy feeling arose, Myung immediately realized that the inner energy from his lower dantian was surging upward like a raging flood. Myung could no longer control the stream of inner energy. Once it surged into the upper dantian, he would completely lose control. Instinctively, Myung immediately tried to stop it from happening. At that moment, Myung suddenly remembered a teaching from the senior sect brother in the past, that those who tried to forcibly control the reverse flow of inner energy were all fools. In this world, there's nothing that can be truly resolved by simply suppressing it, because just like trying to build a dam to block a current, once the current becomes strong enough, it will still break through and continue its rampage. The human body is the same. If you suppress too much, it will collapse. So following the natural flow is the wisest choice. Myung decided to let go and stop resisting. Then his consciousness sank deep into his body. In front of him now, a massive wall covered in countless cracks. Myung could clearly feel it. That wall was the barrier of the upper dantian. Myung placed his hand on the wall and immediately sensed the inner energy on the other side surging like a raging flood. The breach of the upper dantian was only a matter of time. Stopping the inner energy from entering the upper dantian was impossible. At this moment, Myung needed to come up with another solution. Trying to stop the flow of inner energy was pointless. Just let it follow its natural course. Myung no longer worried and chose to remove the barrier. Letting the inner energy surge freely, flowing straight into the upper dantian, all of Myung's acupoints were immediately struck and cleansed fiercely by the inner energy. Just like that. A long night passed. Myung awoke from his cultivation. It was also the moment he lost control and landed hard on his backside from the spot where he had been floating in cultivation all night. After letting the inner energy do whatever it pleased, all of Myung's acupoints had been fully opened in just one night and his entire body had been elevated to a new level. During the dangerous process last night, even the slightest mistake could have left Myung paralyzed or sent him straight to the afterlife. With great danger comes great reward. Myung himself had been enlightened and originally thought that the senior sect brother's words were just exaggeration. He never expected it to carry such profound meaning. Myung was just a swordsman and didn't truly understand the deeper principles of humanity. So it was only after 100 years and a rebirth that Myung finally understood his senior brother's words. In a moment, Myung worried whether he could rebuild Flowery Mountain. But as long as he tried his best, it would be fine. The remaining elixirs no longer had a significant effect on Myung for the time being. But they were still very useful as rewards for the other sect members. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly remembered he had to bring along 2 jars of wine. They had been aged for over 100 years, and Myung was extremely curious about how their flavor would be. Returning to this cave made Myung feel incredibly comfortable. The feeling of countless memories flooded back like that. Sometimes Myung had to come back here. After finishing all the preparations, Myung immediately activated his cultivation. Then he used lightness skill to fly high up the cliff. Unlike the struggling night before now, Myung kicked off the cliff and soared up. As easily as moving on flat ground. He shot straight up, flying all the way into the blue sky. The dawn light illuminated the entire mountain range, making it look like a fairyland. Myung gently landed on the mountain peak. Take a deep breath, wanting to enjoy the fresh air of the new day. But the fresh air was nowhere to be found. All he could smell was a stench rising to the high heavens coming from his own body. At the break of dawn, as usual, the disciples of Flowery Mountain had already dragged themselves out of bed. These kids were starting to feel like they couldn't digest their food anymore, with no idea how much longer they'd have to endure this torment. Some disciples suddenly noticed something strange lately. Myung didn't seem quite right. He had become skinny and haggard. He no longer trained with his brothers in the mornings either. There were some rumors spreading that Myung had suffered a key deviation. Myung's health wasn't stable enough to endure high-intensity training. With that, the kids immediately started thinking about rebelling and refusing to train any further. All this time, the kids from Flowery Mountain have been obediently following Myung's orders. It's all because each of them once got beaten to a pulp by him. But with Myung's current frail and weakened state, the senior brothers should be able to defeat the opponents by now, shouldn't they? The kids started huddling together, plotting how they could gang up and ambush Myung for a beating. Jogul and Yoonjong stood aside, listening to the fellow disciples' discussion without paying any attention. The two of them knew the fellow disciples would soon regret it. Right at that moment, the door to the disciples' quarters opened. From inside, a brilliant radiance shone outward. The disciples widened their eyes and gaped in astonishment. As they saw Myung, now well-built and full of vitality, calmly stepping outside, Myung spoke up and apologized to his fellow brothers for not having trained alongside everyone during the past time. Seeing Myung sincerely reflect on himself like that, the disciples suddenly felt intimidated on the spot, and they immediately tried to reassure him, saying he didn't need to blame himself like that. Myung ignored the senior brothers and continued delivering his sentimental speech to the very end. Then he wrapped it up with a sharp remark, saying that if the training wasn't enough, they simply had to make up for it. Myung pointed toward the mountain, behind the disciples' quarters. Then he declared he would run off, leaving all the brothers no time to even process what he meant. Only then did Myung reveal his devilish nature, saying that half of the disciples who finished last would have to start running all over again. Right after Myung made the announcement, Yoonjong immediately surged to the front and swiftly used light footwork to dash ahead. After that, Jogul quickly followed right behind. It was only then that the remaining brothers realized what was going on. If they ran too slowly, they'd have to do another lap for sure. That would make them cough up blood for real. Myung watched his beloved senior brothers sprinting so fast, they left trails of dust behind, feeling thoroughly satisfied. These little chicks trying to rebel still way too early for that. Myung didn't forbid his brothers from having rebellious thoughts, since those who obey too easily rarely amount to much anyway. However, if they show a cocky attitude before having the skills to back it up, the consequences will be bitter. To become true masters, they must possess extraordinary abilities, and this is something Myung is fully capable of helping his brothers unlock. Turning an individual into a top-level master isn't all that rare, but in the end, that's still just personal strength, and it can't carry the honor of an entire sect. Personal strength alone can't carry the honor of an entire sect. Myung wants to revive Flowery Mountain, so he must ensure that the strength of all the disciples rises together. to further fuel the fighting spirit of those factory-bred chicks. Myung even added that whoever came in last should be ready to skip their meal. Wait until the sun is high in the sky. At last, when the sun was high, the Flowery Mountain disciples managed to drag their worn-out bodies back to the training ground. Everyone completely shut down and collapsed flat on the ground. Only Yoon-jong was barely able to stay on his feet. It wasn't that Yoon-jong had significantly better physical strength than his fellow disciples. It was simply that he had a stronger and more determined spirit. Oh, but Myung was on a completely different level altogether. Besides the big and small pouches of stones hanging all over his body, he was also carrying 2 giant boulders in his hands while running, yet he was still as strong as an ox. Seeing all his fellow disciples completely wiped out, Myung scoffed at them. 100 years ago, he wasn't nearly this weak either. Well, draining them of all their strength wouldn't do any good either. There's no need to think about skipping training either, Myung said. If caught, be prepared to train 10 times harder and don't forget to tidy up all your gear before you can go eat, including the pile of stones Myung just threw everywhere. In the dining hall, although a very abundant meal was laid out before them, the disciples couldn't swallow a bite. The disciples took turns voicing their opinions. They said the training intensity was too harsh. Even the senior brother Yoon-jong was trembling uncontrollably. They found it hard even to pick up their food, let alone eat it. Yoon-jong didn't rush to make a decision. Instead, he turned to ask Jo-gul how he felt. Jo-gul had to admit that the training intensity was extreme. The disciples were only human after all. Constantly pushing their limits made it impossible to endure. However, Jo-gul believed that Myung was fully aware of this. There must be a reason behind his persistence in pushing his fellow disciples to train hard. So Jo-gul suggested waiting a little longer. If the situation didn't improve, they would have to bring it up with Myung. Yoon-jong agreed with this. If that time came, he would be the first to speak up. After a full day of exhausting training, Jo-gul went back to his room and immediately collapsed onto his bed. Though truly exhausted, Jo-gul was determined to follow the training plan Myung set out no matter what. No one knew how long Jo-gul had been asleep. He was suddenly awakened by a calling voice. When he opened his eyes, he saw Myung right beside him. Myung had some good stuff he wanted to give Jo-gul, so he needed Jo-gul to stay quiet for a bit. But how the hell could they stay quiet? When Myung suddenly pulled out a spiritual pill and placed it in his palm, Myung said that Jo-gul definitely needed this more than he did. So he secretly brought it over to Jo-gul. Seeing that Myung gave him the precious spiritual pill and even helped regulate its medicinal power, Jo-gul suddenly felt that thinking of this junior brother as a demon was far too unfair. Little did Jo-gul know the demon Myung was wearing a triumphant smile. Winning someone over at their lowest point, now that was a brilliant strategy. The next day, while observing the disciples practicing their swordsmanship, the overseer suddenly noticed something unusual. Although the disciples were still practicing the same basic sword moves as before, the sharpness and stability had already far surpassed what they used to be. In just a short amount of time, these disciples looked as if they had completely transformed into new people. Eun-gum recalled. Myung had asked for 1 month to carry out his plan. He hadn't expected that in such a short time all the disciples would have improved so significantly. The overseer didn't hold back his praise for the disciples' progress. And as a reward for their efforts, the old man promised to teach the Taiyi Plum Blossom sword to everyone. The kids, upon hearing the praise, were all overjoyed with the changes in themselves. Right at that moment, the sect leader Yoon-jong suddenly came looking for Eun-gum, catching the old man completely by surprise. The sect leader said that something had happened, and it was quite serious. While the sect leader was studying the sword manual on the combined sword technique, he came across something shocking on the last page. The moment Eun-gum turned to that page following sect leader Yoon-jong's instructions, the old man couldn't help but be stunned for a moment. In that combined sword manual, there was a handwritten note left behind. The responsibility of future generations is not to constantly reinvent the martial arts of Flowery Mountain, though martial arts may continue to evolve and develop without end. But the combined sword technique is the foundation, the very root of Flowery Mountain. Eun-gum knew the combined sword technique very well. It was a martial art that had been used since ancient times by Flowery Mountain. A sword technique so detailed it even taught how to properly hold a sword. Eun-gum didn't quite agree with that message. Because the combined sword technique was too slow to learn, they had even created the new combined sword technique to better suit the times. Since the new combined sword technique had become the basic martial art of Flowery Mountain sect leader Yoon-jong came to seek Eun-gum's opinion. The tradition of the sects had always been to follow the path laid out by their predecessors. The will of the founder was something hard to deny. Eun-gum was the one directly responsible for teaching the disciples the basic techniques. So his opinion carried a great deal of weight. In other words, the sect leader wanted Eun-gum to make a decision that whether to follow tradition or stay firm in his resolve to pursue change. Eun-gum said that the biggest reason the new combined sword technique became Flowery Mountain's foundational martial art was to save time. They didn't have much time to leisurely train their disciples, especially when Flowery Mountain could be wiped out at any moment. Before making a decision, Eun-gum wanted to know whether the sect leader saw a future for Flowery Mountain or not. That was a difficult question. Although Flowery Mountain had now been given a chance to transform itself, it had only solved a small part of the mountain of problems it faced. Sect leader Yoon-jong had to apologize because even he couldn't give an exact answer. If that's the case, Eun-gum wanted to oppose the idea of returning to training the combined sword technique. Although the combined sword technique and the new combined sword technique shared the same origin, they were two different martial arts. The combined sword technique was slow but steady, while the new combined sword technique focused on speed and fluidity. At present, the disciples had already grasped the basic parts of the new combined sword technique. If they restarted training with the combined sword technique, it was very likely they wouldn't achieve any results at all. Moreover, Ungum stated that training in the combined sword technique required the practitioner to have a solid and stable lower body. Now, training the disciples to achieve that would take an unknown amount of time. The sect leader seemed to realize something and asked Ungum once more what the requirements for training the combined sword technique were. First was a solid lower body, and in addition, a cautious mindset. Wasn't that exactly what the disciples were showing right now? The sect leader even thought that Ungum had secretly been training the disciples in it all along. Ungum clearly had no such training strategy, and the results those kids were showing came entirely from the brutal training program devised by Myung. Ungum asked the sect leader to wait a moment. The old man needed to confirm something first. Myung was standing in the courtyard picking his nose when suddenly Overseer Ungum called his name, startling him out of his skin. The old man wanted to ask Myung's opinion that whether it was better to go slow and reach farther, or to be fast and more precise. Which one would Myung choose? What's there to think about? Of course, Myung believed that Flowery Mountain needed to go farther. The sect leader was astonished upon hearing those words from Myung. Flowery Mountain was a sect with no small amount of pride. But hearing such a firm statement from a mere kid still took the sect leader by surprise. Myung went on to affirm that if Flowery Mountain was to reclaim its former glory, they couldn't afford to seek short-term comfort. Sect leader Hyunjong and Ungum listened carefully to Myung's opinion. After that, they let him leave first. Well, it was mostly because the two of them felt a bit too embarrassed. They hadn't expected that even their own mindset was inferior to that of a young disciple who had just joined the sect. Ungum guessed that Myung was able to think so freely because he didn't have to worry about food, clothes, or making a living. So all he thought about was how Flowery Mountain could rise to fame once more, no matter how difficult the path might be. Just a brief conversation with Myung was enough for the sect leader to make up his mind about the future development of Flowery Mountain. Establishing a foundational martial art technique is extremely important, because it will also determine the future of Flowery Mountain. Hyunjong made the decision in his capacity as the sect leader. He requested that the fundamental martial art of Flowery Mountain be changed to 6 harmonies. And it didn't stop at just the fundamental techniques. The sect leader Hyunjong felt that the later martial arts disciplines also needed to be reevaluated. Ungum's role in the coming time would be extremely important. Flowery Mountain could no longer remain a dying sect. It was time for the king to return. And to make this happen, the entire Flowery Mountain sect needed complete unity and consensus from top to bottom. The disciples of the same generation as Myung were the very future of Flowery Mountain. Perhaps the current sect leader's generation could not restore Flowery Mountain to its former glory, but the next generation surely would. Meanwhile, Myung was furiously cursing in his head. Because the adults in Flowery Mountain were completely useless, even when the food was served right to their mouths, they still had to ask how to chew it. He truly couldn't deal with these old fools anymore. The more Myung thought about it, the more he felt that if he didn't carry the load, Flowery Mountain would go down the drain sooner or later. And the kid figured he needed to make a secret trip down to Hwaeum soon. Chances were things down there were a complete mess too. Seeing Myung return, looking visibly irritated, the disciples around him honestly had no idea why this demon was upset again. After enduring countless hardships, Flowery Mountain had finally found a moment of peace. Flowery Mountain's financial problems had been resolved beyond expectations, and to prepare for the future, they were even getting ready to rebuild the sect's martial arts foundation. A bright future was waiting ahead. But something felt off. Why did Myung's face look like he was suffering from constipation? Well, it made sense because the scene unfolding before him looked no different from a chaotic marketplace. Myung called Jo-gul out for a quick chat, having heard that Jo-gul came from a well-known merchant family, the son of some kind of transcontinental trading tycoon or whatever. Jo-gul had to clarify right away his background wasn't that grand at all. His father was just a small-time merchant. Myung brushed off that minor detail about what he really wanted to know was Jo-gul's economic perspective on the current situation. After all, the usual trope was that the youngest son of a wealthy family might be a bit of a troublemaker, living lavishly and wildly, but still gifted in business and well-informed, right? Truth is, Myung urgently needed a strategist and advisor. Because with the current chaotic scene and the Flowery Mountain disciples shouting and scrambling to help with trade down here, things were clearly not looking good. It was no surprise that Hwaeum had become so disorderly. This place was originally managed by the Merchants Guild led by the Pavilion Lord Gong. They held significant influence around here. So when those bosses decided to stop working, the workers followed suit. Myung really couldn't swallow Jo-gul's assessment. What kind of influence could that bunch of deceitful swindlers possibly have? Jo-gul had to clarify a bit that the main reason those merchants held influence was because of their extensive networks. Most of the workers were actually their relatives, classic example of bringing the whole clan into the business. However, in Jo-gul's view, the shortage of workers was just a minor issue. What really mattered, Jo-gul said, was that none of the elders from Flowery Mountain had any business skills, and that was the real problem. Myung was seriously pissed after going through all the trouble to reclaim the entire fortune. It ended up being nothing more than pearls hung on a pig's head, with not a single person knowing how to turn it into profit. At that moment, 2 disciples were loudly arguing because one of them had grabbed the wrong tea leaves, so how could they possibly serve customers like that? But you couldn't really blame him either, as the kid had never even tasted expensive tea before. So how was he supposed to tell the good from the bad? Jo-gul concluded that doing business was anything but simple. From sourcing ingredients to managing the workers, not a single standard could be overlooked. As for the current disciples of Flowery Mountain, not only were they clueless when it came to selecting ingredients, but their ability to manage finances was downright terrible. If they couldn't establish partnerships with reliable suppliers of quality ingredients, then suffering losses and getting outpaced by rival forces would be nothing out of the ordinary. Myung didn't quite get it, because if the disciples were lacking in knowledge, then just give them extra lessons, problem solved, right? It wasn't that simple. Not everyone had a passion for learning or an interest in business, and not everyone had the talent to pick things up quickly and dedicate themselves to Flowery Mountain right away. With the current batch of Flowery Mountain disciples, putting them to manual labor was already the best way to make use of them. If this situation kept dragging on like this, then maybe Flowery Mountain should just go ahead and rebrand itself as Beggar's Sect version 2.0. And in times as tough as these, Myung truly realized just how great his sect leader senior brother was. Back then, with his senior brother carrying all the burdens, Myung only had to focus on sword training and enjoy life. Nothing like the 100 struggles he was facing now. Myung tried to reassure himself that complaining was useless and that he needed a solution now, but when he asked Jo-gul for one, how could he possibly know? If this sharp young man had real business skills, he would have already inherited the family's fortune and been swimming in money. Given Flowery Mountain's current dire state, even Jo-gul's father probably couldn't save it. Jo-gul could only assert that if they wanted to run Hwa-Yum's business smoothly, then Flowery Mountain needed a merchant with deep and broad knowledge of trade and goods. He suddenly remembered someone. If Lord Huang were still in Hwa-Yum, perhaps the situation would have already been saved. According to what Jo-gul knew, Lord Huang was a major merchant. His influence spread far and wide. He used to be a strong supporter of Flowery Mountain, and there are even legends about this. If Lord Huang were still helping Flowery Mountain, would surely have solved its current problems by now. But Jo-gul didn't have high hopes for that, as what was there to invest in at Flowery Mountain anyway. Myung disagreed because groups of disciples like him and Jo-gul were the best investment potential. Jo-gul wanted to challenge Myung's boastful claim, but was afraid he'd get punched, so he just let it go. He didn't know if Lord Huang still cared about Flowery Mountain these days, because he was supporting many other places as well. Myung felt this was actually a solid plan if they could just get that old man back. Wouldn't that solve the whole mess here? But Jo-gul immediately shot down Myung's idea. There were rumors that Lord Huang had been bedridden for over a year now, and he might have even lost consciousness. Right at that moment, someone came looking for Myung. It was none other than Instructor Unam. Unam had come to find Myung because something urgent had happened. He needed Myung to make a quick trip back to the mountain. Myung knew that he was being forced into hard labor. Climbing up and down Flowery Mountain was exhausting. He wondered why so many senior disciples who looked taller and stronger than him were not asked to do it while he was just the youngest one, with weak internal energy clearly not capable of handling such tasks. Unam declared that there was no hard labor at all, just to make Myung complain less and stop whining. The uncle just wanted Myung to quickly deliver a letter to the sect leader or other senior disciples. That was all. This letter was from the Upper Grace Escort Group. Jo-gul, upon hearing that name, immediately lowered his voice and reminded Myung, saying that it was the name of Lord Huang's merchant guild. Myung realized that there was something important going on here. Realizing that there was important news involved, Myung no longer refused and accepted the task right away. By the time this kid ran to the middle of the mountain peak, his eyes darted around, but he saw no one. He immediately took out the letter from Lord Huang, addressed to the Flowery Mountain sect. Just by looking at Myung's sly face, it was obvious. It was clear that he was planning to sneak a look at the letter's contents first, especially now that Lord Huang was bedridden with illness. And yet he wrote a letter directly to the leader of the Flowery Mountain sect. There must be some very important news. Myung used a strand of internal energy at the tip of his finger, gently peeled off the seal on the letter. The beginning of the letter was just a few flowery greetings and pleasantries, nothing important, so it could be skipped. The content of the letter was clearly written by Lord Huang's son, not by Lord Huang himself. In the letter, Lord Huang's son mentioned that recently Lord Huang had suddenly shown some strange symptoms. The veins bulged all over his body, and his skin turned a purplish red. In addition, a strange black mark had appeared between his eyebrows. Wait a minute. As Myung read these symptoms, they felt oddly familiar. Why did it seem like the work of that Chun-ma guy he once shaved bald? Lord Huang's son had invited many renowned doctors to examine his father. However, not a single physician could provide an accurate diagnosis. At this point, all they could do was try whatever might help. Lord Huang's son hoped that sect leader Hyun Jong might know something about the symptoms his father was suffering from. As long as there was a way to save Lord Huang's life, the entire merchant guild would be deeply grateful. Lord Huang's son could only place all his hopes in the leader of the Flowery Mountain sect. After finishing the letter, Myung felt that this matter was quite troublesome. If it were just an ordinary illness, there was no way renowned doctors would be unable to handle it. What Lord Huang was suffering from could very well be demonic corruption. At a glance, it might seem like poisoning from the outside. Therefore, the solution that the doctors likely suggested would be how to eliminate the toxins inside Lord Huang's body. However, when Myung looked at the description of those symptoms, he couldn't stay calm. Because they were far too similar to the signs of demonic corruption, the very symptoms caused by the poison attacks of the great demon Chun-ma. Myung felt genuinely annoyed. He had thought he already took care of that guy completely on top of the 10,000 great mountains. Who would have thought that even after 100 years, traces of that guy could still be seen? Myung had a bad feeling it was very likely that those demonic figures were plotting something again. Then Myung got angry again, as those demonic figures would always end up affecting Flowery Mountain one way or another. Clearly there were countless sects across the Central Plains, so why was it always Flowery Mountain that got hit? If based only on the descriptions in the letter, then Myung could not possibly confirm whether Lord Huang was truly afflicted by demonic corruption or not. He had to witness it with his own eyes to be sure. In addition, Lord Huang's son also firmly promised to wholeheartedly repay whoever could save his father, and just hearing that made Myung's eyes light up with the shine of cold, hard cash. Lord Huang's merchant guild was clearly a giant with immense wealth, so if they were truly willing to repay wholeheartedly, how generous would that be? Myung was pretty sure that after 100 years, the number of people who knew about demonic corruption had become extremely rare. Most of those who fully understood Chunma's poison attacks had already died in the final battle on the 10,000 Great Mountains. But Myung always stayed cautious. What if someone had survived by chance and still knew about demonic corruption? Myung absolutely could not accept being beaten to the punch. He wouldn't let anyone steal his meal. Wait, he meant his patient. For the sake of cold hard cash, Myung had to be the one to personally cure Lord Huang's illness. That night, the Flowery Mountain disciples dragged their tired bodies back to the mountain peak. They weren't allowed to stay at Hua Yum, so they had to hike down the mountain every morning and crawl back up to the peak every night. When Yoonjong led his junior brothers up to the entrance of Flowery Mountain, then Jogul had already arrived there at some point earlier. He came rushing over, calling out to Yoonjong saying there was big news. Jogul had only just managed to mention the name Myung. Then Yoonjong immediately jolted in shock and hurriedly chased after Jogul without hesitation. When they reached Myung's room, it had already been empty for who knows how long. But there was something even more noteworthy here. It was that on Myung's bed there was a letter he had left behind. Myung left a note saying that he would be away for a few days. He humbly asked the two senior brothers to take care of everything, and absolutely not to skip any training. Yoonjong read Myung's letter and nearly lost his mind. But in the end he still decided to temporarily cover for Myung and keep his escape from the sect a secret. If Myung said he would only be gone for a few days, then surely this Myung would return soon. Besides, Myung was just a junior disciple who had only recently joined the sect, so probably no one would really notice his disappearance. Jogul was just worried that they wouldn't be able to keep this hidden for long. On the other hand, Yoonjong was more concerned about the reason behind Myung's absence. That kid had better not get into any trouble. By now, Myung had already taken off using lightness skills, soaring like a bird, and who knew how far he was from Flowery Mountain. After soaring around to his heart's content, Myung landed on the ground with a sudden stop, carving out a long trail he needed to take a break before continuing. If he ran non-stop for over 300 kilometers, Myung would probably end up coughing out his lungs. If it were during his peak, then Myung would only need a slight push to leap from one mountain peak to another. Or with just a light step on the water, he could cross an entire river. There was no way he'd be this exhausted and still not even close to the destination like he was now. The place where Myung stopped to rest felt somewhat familiar. It was none other than Tai'an City, where Myung had many memories. Back when Myung was young, specifically in his previous life, Myung used to sneak away here to indulge in drinking and having fun. While he was drunk, Myung accidentally bumped into a few young men from another sect on the street. At first, those guys demanded that Myung apologize to them. Then they started mocking Myung's Flowery Mountain background. When Myung was bumped and dropped his wine gourd, he told those guys to pick it up. But those guys just sneered at him, mocking Flowery Mountain as a classless sect and throwing all sorts of insults. They reminded Myung that this was Tai'an, the territory of the southern sect. They felt the need to teach Myung a lesson, so he would understand the consequences of wandering around in front of someone else's doorstep. Upon hearing that Myung didn't bother saying another word, he lightly tapped his heel, sending his wine gourd flying into the air. The southern sect guys instinctively watched the wine gourd soar through the air. Meanwhile, Myung swiftly moved forward like a gust of wind. He delivered a few basic physical strikes to each of the southern sect disciples. They were stunned for a full 5 seconds. Those southern sect fledglings were suddenly hit by force affecting their bodies, each of them treated with utmost precision. Myung gently caught his wine gourd, but the contents inside had all spilled out, nothing left at all, truly frustrating. Flowery Mountain and the southern sect always fought like cats and dogs, and in Myung's opinion there was no need for the two sects to have any kind of good relationship. First of all, both Flowery Mountain and the southern sect were prestigious sects, with many similarities in their doctrines and sword techniques, so competing bit by bit was only natural. Pride had caused the disciples of the two sects to constantly clash and exchange techniques, and because of this, Flowery Mountain disciples were always cautious when venturing into Tai'an City, the southern sect's home turf. Of course, Myung was an exception. This city was a safe haven where Myung could be sure to avoid the watchful eyes of the sect leader and senior brothers. Of course, Myung would get into plenty of trouble, but he was confident that he was never the one to provoke anyone first. The southern sect guys were always the ones swarming over first to check on Myung's well-being, only to end up receiving his special sleep treatment through physical impact. But Myung had to admit the willpower of those southern sect guys was surprisingly tough. Even with broken arms and legs, they still came crawling to check on Myung, almost like they enjoyed being mistreated. Perhaps it was that stubborn, never-give-up spirit that had built the southern sect into what it was today. If Myung entered Tai'an City wearing Flowery Mountain robes right now, it sounded like trouble was bound to happen. But the guy still convinced himself that there wouldn't be any problem at all. Surely those guys who used to pick fights with him had already kicked the bucket by now. At the estate of the Upper Grace Merchant Guild, someone had just been invited to diagnose and check Lord Huang's condition. Seeing the person shake their head and say it was difficult, Lord Huang's son worried that the poison had seeped too deeply into his father's body, making it impossible to treat. The middle-aged man firmly claimed that his organization was the best in the world when it came to curing poisons. And he was quite certain that Lord Huang was not poisoned at all. Although the symptoms seemed like Lord Huang was being ravaged by a deadly poison, the middle-aged man dared to assert that this was not a man-made toxin. Lord Huang's son immediately lost his composure. He grabbed the man's sleeve, desperate to know what exactly had afflicted his father. But right after that, he realized he had just acted far too rudely. After sending the middle-aged man off, Lord Huang's son sat in front of his father's bed, feeling helpless that he couldn't do anything. He had all the gold and silver in the world, yet in the end, it was all useless. While Lord Huang was suffering in pain at that very moment, tormented by an illness with no known cause. Right at that moment, someone outside requested to enter the room. The one who entered was a man. He was Moksung, an elder of the southern sect, and he advised Lord Huang's son to accept reality. He said that the only way to save Lord Huang was to hold a spiritual ritual. Moksung said that having the southern sect's leader personally conduct the ritual was not something that could be done just because someone wished for it. It was precisely because this was for Lord Huang that the southern sect's leader was making a special exception. Lord Huang's son wasn't ready to make a decision just yet. He still wanted to wait and see if there would be any response to the other pleas for help he had sent out. This made Moksung extremely displeased. But Lord Huang's son was just as annoyed at that moment. He was having to endure Moksung's disrespectful attitude. The southern sect was already one of the great sects in the world, and recently, its fame had been soaring even higher. Perhaps the title of the #1 sword sect under heaven would soon fall into their hands. On top of that, Tai'an City was under the jurisdiction of the southern sect. So the Upper Grace Merchant Guild didn't dare to go head-to-head with them. Surely if they were to conduct the ritual, the southern sect would demand an enormous sum of money. Lord Huang's son wasn't stingy about spending money, but the southern sect's attitude of wanting payment first before saving a life left a bad taste in his mouth. Right at that moment, a servant came running in, announcing that someone from Flowery Mountain had come requesting an audience. Lord Huang's son was utterly astonished. The letter sent to Flowery Mountain was the last one he had dispatched. It should have only just arrived by now, yet someone from Flowery Mountain was already here. Standing nearby, Moksung's expression instantly turned harsher upon hearing that someone from Flowery Mountain had come. He believed that meeting with someone from the Flowery Mountain sect would be nothing but a waste of time. What could a declining sect possibly accomplish anyway? Lord Huang's son said that he was the one who had sent the letter inviting the person from Flowery Mountain, and if they didn't at least welcome the guest and sent them away immediately, it would be far too disrespectful. He immediately followed the servant to meet the representative from Flowery Mountain, who at that moment was still being held outside the gate. The servants did want to receive the person from Flowery Mountain politely, but they didn't know the proper way to go about it. Lord Huang's son didn't dwell on that any longer and hurried straight to the main gate. He then bowed his head low and greeted the representative of the Flowery Mountain sect. He apologized for the discourtesy of not welcoming the guest into the reception hall. At that moment, Lord Huang's son finally noticed that clearly the legs of the person standing before him were those of a child. That was obvious since the person who had come was none other than Myung. Lord Huang's son even thought there might be others as well. So he politely asked Myung where his fellow disciples were. Myung came here alone, so he didn't have any fellow disciples with him. He simply asserted that he knew exactly how to treat Lord Huang, and all that was needed was to take him to see Myung. But first, Myung needed to see the generous reward that Jongui mentioned in the letter. Surely it wouldn't be too unreasonable. Jongui froze right there at the door. He couldn't understand what kind of person the Flowery Mountain sect representative standing before him was. Jongui even thought Myung was joking, so he double-checked. Could it be that he really came alone? No matter how many times Uncle Jongui confirmed it, the answer was always the same. Anyway, there was no one at Flowery Mountain who could solve Lord Huang's problem. This made Jongui feel somewhat underestimated. Why would Flowery Mountain send a kid for this, especially one with such a mocking attitude? At that moment, Moksung also came out to the main gate. Smirking, Jongui thought he had placed his trust in the wrong person. Flowery Mountain was already in decline, so where would they find talent to come help anyway? Moksung also took the chance to insult the Flowery Mountain sect leader, wondering how he could let a mocking kid come as their representative. Myung felt frustrated that he was being underestimated just because he looked young. He switched to serious mode and introduced himself to Jongui, and asserted that Flowery Mountain had received the letter that Jongui had sent. Myung knew to some extent about the symptoms Jongui described in the letter, so he took the initiative to come here. Hearing that Jongui was startled, Myung was the first person who dared to claim to know a little about Master Huang's condition. Even before that, whether they were renowned physicians or top martial artists who came to diagnose, no one had been able to offer any explanation for Master Huang's condition. Moksung was visibly annoyed when he saw Myung so confident. He threw shade at Myung for being so young yet so talkative. He then advised Jongui not to waste time on Myung and just close the door to see the guest off. At that moment, Myung suddenly interrupted. He clasped his hands behind his back, then asked who that person was to be so full of malice. A moment of silence filled the air. Then Moksung realized that Myung was talking to him. Hwa-son, Flowery Mountain. Myung lightly scratched his ear and exclaimed, "Oh, so you're from the southern sect." He even said he thought the other guy was just a quack doctor. Myung sarcastically asked if the southern sect had already found a way to treat Master Huang. Myung sarcastically asked if the southern sect had already found a way to treat Master Huang, to which Moksung immediately asserted that Master Huang had gone against the proper path in his cultivation and was suffering from backlash. Therefore, the only cure could be to set up an altar and pray for forgiveness from the heavens. Oh wow, Myung didn't expect there to be an explanation like that. Then we should call a shaman right away. It's a professional matter, so of course we should let a professional handle it. Moksung was about to say that the southern sect could handle it themselves. But Myung immediately cut him off. Both sects had always insisted that worshipping heaven and earth was the duty of Taoist priests, not something for these two martial sects to deal with. Moksung kept getting snapped back at by Myung from start to finish, so he couldn't hold back anymore. He was so furious he was about to scold Myung, but Myung didn't even bother to pay any attention at all. Seeing he couldn't provoke Myung, Moksung then turned to Jongui and complained that Myung was being too insolent and should be kicked out immediately. Jonggi held back and said enough, Moksung. He warned Moksung that this place was still the Upper Grace Escort Group. This is not the courtyard of the southern sect. How the Upper Grace Escort Group receives guests is decided by Jonggi. Jonggi shifted his attention to Myung, wanting to confirm a few things first. Myung had claimed that he could give a rough diagnosis of Master Huang's condition, so Jongui wanted to hear what he had to say. Myung heard that Master Huang often traveled for trade in the Upper Han region, so he must have passed through the 10,000 Great Mountains quite a lot, right? Myung put on a victorious look when he saw Jonggi stunned on the spot. But he thought it was over. Jongui was just startled for fun. Myung guessed completely wrong and was slightly startled. Then he switched to the suspicion that Master Huang might have been ambushed, but Jonggi denied it again, saying that for years Master Huang hadn't been visited by any assassins. Myung became more and more confused. He couldn't understand where exactly Master Huang had gotten into trouble. Jonggi, hearing Myung make such wild guesses, momentarily felt all hope vanish into thin air. Seeing that Moksung on the side sneered contemptuously. He didn't forget to throw shade, saying Flowery Mountain was full of snakes. Jonggi also thought carefully, before deciding, although he could see that Myung was very eager to help. But he showed no real value, so Jonggi had no choice but to ask Myung to go back. Myung didn't expect himself to keep guessing wrong like that, watching the chance to strike it rich so close slip further and further over the horizon. He couldn't just stand there and watch helplessly. Myung hurriedly listed a series of symptoms. First, the body was reddish-purple in color. The whole body was icy cold, and running a hand over Master Huang's skin would make it briefly turn pale. Before losing consciousness, Lord Huang was trembling uncontrollably as if he had malaria. In addition, there are many spots appearing not only in the center of the glabella. Jonggi, upon hearing this, hurriedly flung open the main door, not understanding how Myung could recite the symptoms of the illness so perfectly. There is no need for Myung to prove anything further. Jonggi had already seen hope in him and respectfully invited Myung to quickly come inside and examine his father. Seeing Myung back out like that, Moksung shouted loudly, claiming that he was only listing common symptoms of someone struck by yin energy. Jongui immediately retorted, if Moksung dares to claim that Lord Huang was struck by yin energy like everyone else, then why doesn't the other party quickly take action to treat him? Seeing Moksung speechless and unable to respond, Jonggi immediately demanded that the other party shut their mouth, or he would have to reconsider his relationship with the southern sect. Moksung was very upset but didn't know what else to do. He could only grumble and leave this place first. Very quickly, Myung was brought by Jonggi to Lord Huang's room. Seeing Huang Lord's condition on the bed, Myung found it even worse than he had anticipated. Certainly, Huang Lord has been infected by evil energy, but it's probably not the genuine kind. Otherwise, an elderly and frail person like Huang Lord could not have survived for an entire year like this. Myung grasped Huang Lord's arm. Then he transmitted a flow of his own vital energy into it. Jongui, standing nearby, saw Myung holding his father's hand and remained silent in thought, worried that his father's illness must be very severe. Myung, with a calm face, declared that treating Huang Lord was not difficult at all. Jongui, still skeptical, advised Myung not to try too hard because anyone who came to visit Huang Lord's illness was also powerless, so he was already used to it. Hey, wait a minute, what did Myung just say? Myung reaffirmed once again that Huang Lord's illness was nothing difficult to cure. He has already done a preliminary treatment, so Huang Lord won't die. At this moment, the area between Huang's eyebrows looks much brighter. But Myung said that to completely cure it, some preparation is still needed. The first thing, Myung wants to have a big satisfying meal first since you haven't eaten anything all morning. Jongui really prepared a lavish meal for Myung, then respectfully asked what needed to be prepared to cure his father. Actually, what Myung needs to prepare most here is strong physical health, so all he needs is to be well fed. Myung reminded Jongui that treating Lord Huang is not difficult. What needs attention is finding the culprit behind this matter. Myung wanted to know who was the closest person to Lord Huang. Someone who had access to even Lord Huang's eating and sleeping routines within the guild, and of course, excluding Jonggi himself. Jongui didn't understand why Myung was asking about that, but if he were to exclude himself, there were still far too many people who had contact with Lord Huang. However, to meet the standards Myung was asking for, there were only 5 people in the merchant guild who qualified. Jonggi still couldn't understand. What exactly was Myung trying to find from those people? Myung couldn't tell if Jonggi was pretending to be clueless or genuinely oblivious, but looking at his father's condition, it was clear he had definitely been harmed by someone. Which meant that someone inside the merchant guild was the problem. Hearing that, Jonggi slammed the table and stood up, accusing Myung of making baseless accusations. He insisted that the people in the guild were bonded like blood relatives, so there was no way anyone would try to harm each other. Myung advised Junggi to calm down and not lose his temper. He was just a little suspicious, that's all. If it wasn't someone from the merchant group who caused it, then isn't that even better? Myung could confirm that it had to be someone close to Lord Huang who used demonic arts. Only then could he have been infected with demonic energy for such a long time. Junggi wanted to know how Myung planned to continue the investigation, but Myung had no intention of doing anything more. What he had already told Junggi was more than enough. Besides, Myung actually needed a bit of help from Jongui for something. It's just that the wine Jonggi prepared for the meal was really delicious. Myung kindly asked his uncle to prepare another bottle for him. Meanwhile, over at Moksung, the old man was still bitter about seeing Myung's arrival and being humiliated by him, especially when Moksung caught sight of the rival aura from that kid, recognizing the unique deadly style of the Plum Blossom swordsmanship. Sitting beside Moksung was a later-generation disciple of the southern sect named Songbak. He was curious whether Elder Moksung was still bitter because of thoughts about the Plum Blossom swordsmanship. Hearing the title, Moksung felt even more bitter than eating chili. He couldn't accept that the title of swordmaster belonged to a brat like that. Although the Plum Blossom swordsmanship had fallen over 100 years ago, the opponent's name still echoed loudly even to this day. Songbak could confidently say that where there's a name, there's a legacy. The skill of the Plum Blossom swordsmanship must have been on an absolutely dominant level. Moksung grew furious because the title Plum Blossom swordsmanship was only part of the issue. What truly mattered was the rumor spreading everywhere that the boy from Mount Hua could actually heal Lord Huang. And what made Moksung even more anxious was hearing that there had already been some initial progress. Songbak could fully grasp the seriousness of the situation. Lord Huang was a man who clearly repaid both grace and grudge. If he was truly revived by someone from Mount Hua, then Mount Hua would surely gain the full support of the Upper Grace escort group. The Southern Edge sect couldn't allow that to happen. They had to stop Myung at all costs. Songbak immediately offered to be the one to drive Myung out. If Moksung personally stepped in, it would look too much like bullying the weak. Having Songbak's group act would be less damaging to their reputation. Even so, Moksung still worried that Southern Edge sect would be seen as picking on a child. But Songbak reassured him that it was fine. After all, tensions between Southern Edge sect and Mount Hua had always been high. If they happened to cross paths and exchanged a few sword techniques going a bit overboard, probably wouldn't be a big deal. Songbak even brought up the Blossom Sword exchange as a legitimate excuse for him to freely make a move against Myung. Moksung was starting to feel convinced, but he still maintained a stern demeanor, reminding that if things went too far with Myung, it could bring a bad reputation to Southern Edge sect people in the martial world would mock them for it. Songbak understood the hidden message behind Moksung's words right away, who was subtly warning that whoever laid hands on Myung would have to face serious consequences. But along with that would come a generous reward no less tempting. After being left alone in the room, Moksung began to quietly reflect Mount Hua in its current state might look like a sickly cat. But back in the days when Moksung was still young, Mount Hua was a fierce old tiger, no one dared to mess with it. If Mount Hua hadn't been dragged into the battle with Chunma back then, the Southern Edge sect likely wouldn't have been able to rise and surpass Mount Hua as smoothly as it has today. Seeing Myung show up here, Moksung immediately guessed that Mount Hua was starting to take steps to rebuild its external connections. He absolutely would not allow Mount Hua to rise again. Meanwhile, outside the tavern, Songbak led his junior disciples and quickly set off to find Myung. Songbak's thoughts were simple, just rough Myung up a little, then kick him back to where he came from, and the mission would be done. Although Songbak wasn't fond of bullying kids, this was a chance to prove himself in front of the elder one he couldn't pass up. Go Hui, walking beside Songbak, felt a bit worried, wondering if someone might be secretly escorting Myung. But Songbak dismissed that thought, assuming Mount Hua managed its disciples so poorly that they could just wander off wherever they pleased. While Songbak was still thinking about how to find Myung, he suddenly stopped in his tracks. There was no need to search anymore, because Myung was standing right there in front of him. Myung was casually wandering around, when he suddenly turned his head in surprise upon hearing someone greet him. It was none other than Songbak, who stepped forward politely and took the initiative to say hello. Songbak tried his best to show respect, but Myung remained nonchalant and indifferent, clearly not caring at all. When asked where he was going, Myung casually replied that he was on his way to check on Lord Huang's condition. Deep down, Songbak scoffed countless renowned physicians and powerful experts had already come and failed. There was no way a mere kid like Myung could perform any kind of miracle. Songbak forced a cheerful smile and continued chatting with Myung. He brought up the long-standing tradition of martial exchanges between Mount Hua and Southern Edge sect, then mentioned the upcoming Tonghua exchange event to see if Myung was aware of it. But this event seemed like something freshly invented so naturally, Myung had no idea what it was. Seeing that Myung had no clue about the Tonghua exchange event, yet still acted all smug as usual, Songbak felt a sudden urge to punch him right then and there, but Songbak held it in. He politely extended an invitation to Myung, asking him to take part in the Tonghua exchange event, saying it was because he wanted to witness the legendary swordsmanship of Mount Hua. According to Songbak's plan, Myung would refuse at first. Then Songbak would apply pressure and force him to join through various means. But Songbak absolutely did not expect that Myung would agree on the spot, and even put on that provocative expression asking, "You looking for a fight or something?" Songbak even wanted to rephrase things a bit to make it sound more proper, But Myung didn't care at all if it's a fight you want, just say it straight. He's never been afraid of anyone anyway. Still, Myung threw out one friendly question first. You're not going to regret this, right? Very quickly, Myung and Songbak were already standing face to face in the sparring arena. That guy Songbak was still rambling on, reminding Myung not to get too traumatized after this whole thing, saying all sorts of stuff. Songbak kept rambling about principles, clearly hinting that Myung should just head straight back to Mount Hua instead of dueling and embarrassing himself. But Myung was already tired of it. Since when did the Southern Edge sect only care about thunderous trash talk? If we're fighting, then fight already. Let's see what you've got. Hearing Myung's sarcastic jab, Songbak was so furious that veins started popping on his forehead. He couldn't hold back the burning urge to give Myung a solid beating right then and there. Songbak didn't care about anything else anymore. He just wanted a full-on no-holds-barred duel with Myung right then and there. Just as he was getting serious, Myung suddenly spoke up and shattered his momentum completely. Oh, and it's not that I have anything against you or your challenge, Myung added casually. Then turned to Go Hui, who was standing behind. Mind letting me borrow your sword for a bit, just want to play around with it. Seeing Myung's completely unserious expression, both Songbak and Go Hui were left utterly dumbfounded. How could a disciple from a sword-focused sect like Mount Hua say something so ridiculous? The very first thing a sword cultivator learns upon joining a sword sect is to treasure their own weapon above all else. Letting someone else touch your sword, that's an absolute no-go. Songbak even wanted to interrogate Myung. Why didn't he bring a sword with him in the first place? But Myung just shrugged it off, saying that he didn't think he need to fight anyone, so why would he bring one? And if no one wanted to lend him a sword, fine, he'll just grab a tree branch or something and use that. That indifferent tone of Myung's god, it was infuriating. Songbak immediately asked Go Hui to lend the opponent his sword, so the world wouldn't accuse Southern Edge sect of bullying someone who didn't even have a weapon. With words like that, how could anyone argue back? Go Hui had no choice but to toss his sword over for Myung to borrow. Myung casually slung his sword over his shoulder. With one hand still casually clasped behind his back, he nonchalantly declared that the duel could begin. Songbak still wanted to argue. Why didn't Myung draw his sword? This was just an exchange of techniques, not a life-or-death fight, so what was the point of unsheathing it? Constantly bombarded by Myung's shameless attitude, Songbak felt his patience had finally reached its limit. Originally, Songbak just intended to mess around with Myung a bit and then send him back to his den. But at this point, unless he broke a few of Myung's bones, Songbak wouldn't feel satisfied. What happened next didn't matter for now. Songbak just wanted to give Myung a proper beating, then deal with everything else later. Seeing the other guy still not making a move, Myung even spoke up to urge him he didn't have all day to entertain this opponent. Songbak followed Myung's lead and didn't draw his sword either. He took his stance, then launched himself toward Myung at lightning speed. As soon as he got within striking range, Songbak didn't hesitate and swung his sword in a horizontal slash toward Myung. But Myung had already raised his sword in time to block it. But the force behind Songbak's strike was quite powerful. It actually knocked Myung back from his position. It caught him a little off guard. Songbak didn't give his opponent a moment to think. He stepped in again and swung a horizontal slash right in front of Myung. Once again, Myung successfully blocked the attack. But he was growing more and more surprised by Songbak. Go Hui stood on the sidelines watching the fight with a relaxed attitude. He was certain that his senior brother couldn't possibly lose. Watching the two in the arena exchanging blows back and forth non-stop, Go Hui was sure that Myung had already pissed Songbak off big time. But the match was still relatively balanced. Any bystander would surely think that Myung was holding his ground quite well. Meanwhile, Songbak, who could have ended the match at any moment, was holding back his power to prolong the exchange with Myung, avoiding the accusation of bullying a kid. At least in Go Hui's imagination, Songbak was still going easy on him. At that moment, Songbak successfully closed in and got within striking distance of Myung. Then he swung his sword in a deadly upward diagonal slash from below. Anyone else probably would have taken a serious beating by now. But Myung was still able to perfectly block the opponent's strike with the sword in his hand. He was only pushed back slightly, nothing more. At this point, Songbak felt something was off. He had started getting serious, yet Myung was still able to defend against his attacks. Songbak recalled that during the very first attack, Myung had even raised his sword to defend before he himself had revealed his move. It was as if Myung had read Songbak like an open book. Songbak absolutely refused to believe it. Looking at Myung, he was probably only as old as Songbak's youngest sibling. A mere child couldn't possibly possess such a masterful level of swordsmanship. Songbak charged forward with full force, swinging his sword down at Myung's head as if he were chopping firewood. But at the very last moment, Songbak subtly shifted his footing to make the attack even more dangerous. Who would have thought Myung simply tilted his body slightly and angled his sword to deflect Songbak's strike, driving it straight into the ground. To his surprise, Myung simply tilted his body slightly and angled his sword to deflect Songbak's strike straight into the ground. Songbak was feeling more and more bewildered. Even within the Southern Edge sect, there weren't many brothers who could withstand his sword like that. Songbak was starting to lose control. He wanted to unleash his inner energy. Songbak's inner energy burst out like a raging whirlwind. Frustrated, he declared that his sword techniques could slice the whole world in half, let alone a mere brat like Myung. Songbak unleashed the 13 heaven-piercing strikes, the ultimate sword technique of the Southern Edge sect, and furiously charged straight at Myung. Go Hui, watching from the sidelines, grew extremely worried. If Songbak didn't hold back, someone could actually die. To his surprise, Songbak still managed to stay clear-headed. In the final moment, he was able to suppress his inner energy and forego the attack on Myung. It seemed like nothing had happened, but suddenly Myung was struck by a shockwave from somewhere and sent flying backward. In Songbak's dazed eyes, Myung was sent flying and slammed straight into the wooden door behind him. He spat out a large mouthful of blood and then collapsed motionless on the ground. The atmosphere fell completely silent in an instant. Then Go Hui's loud shout shattered the silence. Songbak still wanted to explain the situation, but Go Hui completely ignored him and hurriedly rushed over to Myung's side. He then lifted Myung into his arms to check on his condition. Songbak was completely baffled. He had clearly neutralized all his inner energy at the very last moment. Yet the moment Songbak's sword touched Myung's, he was blasted backward even faster than a cannonball. Clearly, no matter how powerful Songbak's attacks had been before, Myung had always been able to deflect them perfectly. And yet now he was sent flying by a strike that wasn't even at full power. It was completely absurd. At that moment, Myung lying in Go Hui's arms began convulsing before spitting out blood like a high-pressure water jet. Seeing Myung spitting blood like a bursting spring, Go Hui was truly panicked. At this moment, Songbak was completely stunned as well. In a situation like this, anyone watching would immediately conclude that Songbak was at fault. Right then, amidst all this chaos, a voice rang out, making Songbak break out in a cold sweat. The person who arrived was Hwang Jonghui. He was utterly shocked by what was unfolding before his eyes. Very quickly, a doctor invited by the Yinha trade group arrived to promptly assess Myung's injuries. The doctor confirmed that Myung's condition was extremely serious. He had lost too much blood, leaving his body severely weakened. Myung couldn't be left lying there any longer. He needed to be taken back for treatment immediately. In the courtyard, only Yonggi, Songbak, and Go Hui remained. This time Songbak was truly screwed. Even if he bathed in the Talich River, he still wouldn't be able to clear his name. Jonghui couldn't bear to watch any longer. Southern Edge was supposed to be a prestigious Orthodox sect, yet they showed no mercy even to a mere child. Jonghui firmly stated that he had witnessed the entire incident with his own eyes, so there was no need for any explanation. He swore he would never forget what happened today. Jonghui demanded that the Southern Edge sect immediately leave his trade manor estate. Just then Mokseong arrived. Mokseong had no idea what had happened to make Yonggi so unyielding, but when he saw the remnants of the battlefield, he instantly fell silent. He could immediately tell that Songbak had acted recklessly and brought disaster upon himself. Mokseong even tried to excuse it all as just an accident. But how could Jonggi possibly accept such an explanation? It was clear that Myung was Lord Hwang's last hope. He had already shown signs that he might be able to save him. And then all of a sudden he was beaten half to death by someone from the Southern Edge sect, calling it an accident. Who in their right mind would believe that? Songbak wanted to explain that he had fully controlled his strength to avoid going too far. But the problem was, the marks left at the scene completely betrayed him. Songbak wanted to explain that he had fully controlled his strength to avoid going too far. But the problem was, the marks left at the scene completely betrayed him. Jonggi shut Songbak down, leaving him no room to explain how could a disciple of the Nam sect raise his sword against a child. Even if that kid was from Mount Hua and it was just a simple martial exchange, Myung and Songbak clearly weren't even in the same age group. No matter how you put it, it still looked like Songbak was bullying the weak and nearly caused a fatal incident on top of that. Jonggi didn't want to hear another word of explanation. He demanded that all disciples of the Southern Edge sect leave the Yinha trade group by the end of the day, no negotiations. Mokseong knew that arguing now would only make things worse, so he had no choice but to agree with Jonghui. However, he still tried to emphasize that the Nam sect only wanted to save Lord Hwang and had no ulterior motives whatsoever. Sure, that really touched Jonggi's heart, but deep down, no one really knows what each person is thinking. After Jonghui left, Songbak was about to speak up, but Mokseong cut him off. He announced that he and Go Hui would return to the sect first. As for Songbak, he was forced to stay behind and find a way to atone for his mistake. If he couldn't earn Jonghui's forgiveness, then he needn't bother returning to the Southern Edge sect at all. Hearing that, Songbak was furious. He had been cornered completely, yet he had no choice but to obey the elder's orders. As for Myung, he was currently diagnosed with severe internal chaos of his vital energy and blood. His condition was truly critical. At the very least, thanks to the efforts of the middle-aged man standing nearby, Jonggi Myung's life was no longer in immediate danger. However, for him to regain consciousness, the man estimated it would still take a few more days. Jonggi could only hope that Myung would recover soon. At this point, he was the only one who had made real progress in finding a way to treat Lord Hwang. Jonggi figured this was his last chance to save his father. Thinking about how the Southern Edge sought to challenge Myung, and ended up beating him to such a near-death state, Jonggi truly struggled to hold back his rage. At that moment, the middle-aged man beside him suddenly asked Jonggi whether it was really true that Myung could heal Lord Hwang. After all, something about it just didn't sit right. Jonggi knew that too. But Myung was the first person who could accurately describe Lord Hwang's symptoms even before seeing him in person. Moreover, after receiving preliminary treatment from Myung, Lord Hwang's condition had indeed shown clear improvement. All in all, Jonggi had pinned his star of hope entirely on Myung, so the most important thing right now was to treat Myung properly and help him recover. That night, in the room where Myung was resting, a figure dressed in black quietly appeared and approached. He moved to stand before Myung's bed, and then from his two fingers an ominous stream of red-black energy began to flow. The intruder clearly intended to eliminate Myung. Without a moment's hesitation, he thrust his sinister energy straight toward the boy's neck as he lay in bed. But unexpectedly, the man missed. And at that moment, Myung was wide-eyed staring straight at him, his head tilted to the side to dodge the attack. Myung grabbed the masked man's arm, then slowly sat up with a victorious smile. He had successfully lured out someone using demonic energy. The man hidden beneath the black cloak was utterly panicked when Myung suddenly woke up and caught him. Without hesitation, he unleashed demonic energy from his other arm but that strike was nothing. There was no way someone like him could ever land a hit on Myung. That guy even got his thick skull borrowed by Myung. Headbutted and sent flying backward. The anonymous man didn't stop. He spun around and tried to lunge at Myung again, but Myung had already leapt into the air, completely evading the enemy's palm strike. Seeing Myung suspended in midair, the man assumed he had him for sure this time. All he had to do was unleash one palm strike. Now there was no way Myung could dodge it no matter how fast he was. Indeed, Myung didn't dodge, or more precisely, he didn't even bother to. He simply unleashed a kick infused with his inner energy and blasted the opponent's palm strike away. While the man stood there, dumbfounded, mouth agape in shock, Myung gently landed on the ground and calmly offered a little clarification about the situation. He wasn't the one being caught. It was this man who had just been caught red-handed by Jongui. Turns out, the one who had been trying to ambush Myung all this time was none other than Jabok Bun, the middle-aged man who had just come to examine Myung earlier. Myung casually picked up a scale fragment from the floor and used it to tie up his long hair. Then Jongui stepped forward from the shadows, and he firmly confirmed once again that they had successfully lured out the culprit behind the attempt on Lord Huang's life. Originally, Jongui had only been half suspicious. He never expected that Myung would actually manage to draw out a real traitor. Jabok couldn't understand why Myung and Jongui would suspect him in the first place. Myung politely clarified that he hadn't suspected Jabok specifically. In fact, he had no idea who the culprit was. He merely acted as though he could treat Lord Huang, then pretended to be seriously injured and bedridden. That way, the real culprit would surely seize the chance to eliminate him. Myung was certain that the one who harmed Lord Huang would take this chance to eliminate him. Doing so would shift all the blame onto the Southern Edge sect. Jabok hadn't expected that the Southern Edge sect would end up getting involved in this staged scenario. But how could he have known Myung never even cooperated with those guys? It wasn't his plan for the Southern Edge group to jump in at that exact moment. Still, since they did, Myung would have been a fool not to take advantage of it. Jabok was still puzzled. Wasn't Myung supposed to be seriously injured? But if Myung didn't know how to fake an illness, how could he have come up with such a clever plan to catch the traitor? Myung guessed that the other party probably had 100,000 questions, but who had time to answer them? The most important thing was that Jabok had been identified as the culprit behind the attempt on Lord Huang's life. Little did anyone expect Jabok not only showed no fear, but also smiled confidently at that moment. He insisted that he had only intended to assassinate Myung. How could that possibly prove he was the one who tried to harm Lord Huang? Jabok pointed out that Myung's argument was missing the core issue. He had no reason to harm Lord Huang, since Lord Huang treated him very well. Even Jongyi had never once suspected Jabok. As for Jabok's reason for wanting to assassinate Myung, his excuse was that Myung's martial arts were extraordinary, yet he tried to keep it hidden. Jabok accused Myung of deceiving Jongyi, saying that countless renowned doctors and masters had come and failed to cure Lord Huang, so what could a kid like Myung possibly do? Jabok explained that he acted on his own because Jongyi had been deceived and wouldn't listen to his explanations anyway. That Jabok fellow could be said to lie in the blink of an eye. Yet he quickly came up with a justification to legitimize the assassination attempt on Myung. Unfortunately, Myung was utterly fed up hearing Jabok talk. He stepped forward. He wrapped his fist in inner energy, ready to finish off Jabok right then and there. Startled by the threat, Jabok instinctively lashed out with a retaliatory strike. But unexpectedly, right after a light clash, Myung immediately came to a halt. He raised his arm, now stained a dark purplish red, looking exactly like Lord Huang's current condition. Myung explained that if anyone got hit by Jabok's poisoned palm, it wouldn't be long before they ended up on the altar. Myung had inner energy and still got affected so easily. How could an ordinary person like Lord Huang possibly withstand it? Even so, Myung was still giving Jabok one last chance to explain himself. All Jabok had to do was name one other person close to Lord Huang who could have infused demonic energy into him. If he could, then Jabok would be considered innocent. At this point, there was nothing left to say. Jongyi immediately ordered his men to arrest Jabok. If he resisted, they were free to take him down on the spot. Seeing two martial artists charging fiercely toward him, Jabok could no longer talk his way out. He had no choice but to go all out and fight. At the same time, in another part of the manor grounds, Songbak recalled Moksung's request before leaving, and couldn't help but feel like his future looked incredibly bleak. Just then, a distant commotion drew Songbak's attention. Over here, Jabok unleashed a powerful demonic technique, sending the two martial artists flying. Jongui was lucky to be protected by Myung, so he remained completely unharmed. Things had come to this point. No matter how slick Jabok's tongue was, he couldn't talk his way out of it anymore. So hurry up and catch him. Myung still needs to get some sleep. Jabok felt bitter seeing Myung so casually declare his arrest like it was nothing. Once he unleashed his demonic claw at full power, Myung wouldn't stand a chance, just a little duckling in comparison. Well, it's not like Myung planned to fight Jabok alone anyway. He had reinforcements on his side too. Just mentioned, that person appeared. Songbak showed up just as Myung had mentioned him. Seeing Myung calling out to him like a savior, Songbak froze on the spot, completely confused and not understanding a thing. Seeing Myung's expression tilting subtly toward Jongyi, suddenly Songbak's brain clicked. Wasn't this the perfect chance to make up for his mistake? With that thought, Songbak didn't hesitate for a second. He drew his sword and charged straight into the room to join the battle against Jabok. Myung calmly observed the battle and confirmed that the matter had already been resolved. If even the disciples of the great sect can't capture a half-baked demon like Jabok, then they might as well go smash their heads into a jar. At the same time, Myung also performed some kind of technique that gradually made the red-purple bruise on his arm disappear before Yoongi's astonished eyes. Inside the room, the sound of clanging rang out continuously, while outside Myung sat leisurely on the doorstep, smacking his lips and yawning over and over. He tilted his head back to gaze at the night sky for a moment, then lowered it again, glancing at the family duel inside the room from the corner of his eye. It's already been a whole hour since Songbak jumped in to fight Jabok to win back Jonggui's favor, yet it's still not over. It might as well let Myung handle it himself and get it done quickly. Right at that moment, Jabok was also worn out, let out a groan and collapsed to the ground. Songbak, hair disheveled and gasping for breath, still managed to turn his head, announced that he had subdued the villain. Jonggi broke into a sweat just watching. But let's say he's acknowledged the contribution of the Southern Edge sect. That's good enough, right? Songbak had been waiting for that one line from Jonggi, and right after hearing it, he collapsed on the spot. Jonggi looked at Myung, who stood beside him with hands behind his back, calmly observing everything, and couldn't help but feel a stir in his heart. A problem that had troubled the entire merchant group for a whole year, but Myung had found and resolved it in just 2 days. Jonggi wanted to believe this was just a simple problem, but he quickly dismissed that thought. If it were simple, the merchant group wouldn't have been completely helpless like that. Jonggui felt as if the person standing next to him was a seasoned master who had attained enlightenment, hiding in the form of a mere child. Jonggi couldn't hold back his curiosity and asked Myung why Jabok wanted to harm his father. To be honest, Myung had no idea what the reason was, and hadn't foreseen things turning out this way either. Don't overestimate Myung like he knows everything. If you want to know why Jabok tried to assassinate Lord Huang, just wait for the authorities to investigate. As for Myung, he's just solving the problem to claim his reward. That reminds him that Myung was actually quite curious whether the reward had been fully prepared yet. Jongui assured him there was no need to worry, he had already taken care of everything. However, Jonggi needed to remind Myung that the main issue hadn't been resolved yet. He didn't ask Myung to hunt down the culprit, but to heal his father. Myung definitely remembered that, and he was sure he would heal Lord Huang properly. As long as Myung could heal his father, Jonggi promised that the Upper Grace escort group would fully support Mount Hua. Hearing that, Myung quickly grabbed Jonggi's hand, which made the latter think he was deeply touched. But no such luck. Myung was actually setting the record straight. The reward was his alone. Why should all of Mount Hua get a share? You only eat if you do the work. Jonggi was left completely speechless. No matter how noble an image he had pictured of Myung, the harsh truth remained. This young man's mind wasn't exactly normal. The next day, Myung went to Lord Huang's room. It was time for him to handle official business. At the moment, there was only one difficult problem left. Myung didn't have enough confidence that he could completely heal Lord Huang. Myung had only been boasting to build credibility. Whether he could actually heal the old man was still a big question mark. Right now, he wasn't the overpowered plum blossom swordmaster dominating every grain of rice, but just a guy with mediocre inner strength. If he accidentally triggered a burst of demonic energy, it would be a total disaster. If he messed up, Lord Huang would definitely kick the bucket in a heartbeat. But if he didn't try, Myung would never know whether he could actually do it or not. Overthinking would only give him a headache, so Myung decided to just channel his inner energy into Lord Huang's body and begin the treatment. To be safe, Myung even split off a strand of his consciousness to guide his inner energy as it entered Lord Huang's body. At this moment, the inside of the old man's body had already been almost completely taken over by demonic energy. Those strands of demonic energy had even materialized into deadly serpents, each one brimming with danger. Seeing the serpent-like demonic energy lunging toward him, Myung used his inner power to conjure a sword, preparing for a blood-soaked battle against his foe. Myung didn't know whether he could succeed or not, but as long as he still had a bit of strength left, he would fight to the very end. Inside Lord Huang's body, Myung's consciousness, carrying the sword forged from his inner power, began charging left and right, tearing through the serpent-like demonic energy. Meanwhile, on the outside, the red-purple bruises on Lord Huang's skin also began to gradually fade away. Inside Lord Huang's body, no matter how the demonic energy tried to launch a coordinated attack, Myung's consciousness was still able to swiftly and decisively destroy the enemy. Myung's inner power at this moment was incredibly pure. He had chosen to discard all the impurities and kept only the most refined essence. That's why, although the total amount of his inner power was a bit limited, its quality was pure like distilled water. The demonic energy in Lord Huang's body was being pushed back rapidly. As long as the old man could endure long enough, Myung would surely be able to purge all the demonic energy from his body. Inside Lord Huang's body, just as Myung's will was fighting fiercely, and the victory seemed almost within reach, he suddenly sensed that something wasn't quite right. The demonic energy had stopped actively attacking Myung's will. Instead, it chose to make a run for it. Myung immediately pulled his consciousness back to scan the body and see where the demonic energy was gathering inside Lord Huang. He could have stayed calm without looking, but once he did, he was shocked. The demonic energy had gathered entirely at the top of the old man's head. Myung couldn't recklessly attack the demonic energy on Lord Huang's head. Just one small mistake, and the old man would be off to meet King Yama instantly. But at this point, Myung couldn't retreat even if he wanted to. The demonic energy accumulating on top of Lord Huang's head was swelling larger and larger. stuck between a rock and a hard place. Then Myung had no choice but to take a reckless risk. Myung pinpointed the demonic energy's concentration from the outside, then quickly placed his hand on Lord Huang's forehead. He decided to draw the demonic energy into his own body. Allowing the demonic energy from Lord Huang's body to rush straight into his own caused Myung immense pain, and he couldn't help but let out a cry of agony. The intense pain struck like a thunderbolt, causing Myung to collapse to the floor, but he kept urging himself not to give up. As his mind was being invaded rapidly, Myung's whole body turned red and purple, looking just like a boiled shrimp. Myung didn't want to collapse under the demonic energy's power, but his vision was rapidly fading. If he couldn't stay conscious, then it would be game over right there. Myung's young body couldn't hold out much longer, so he quickly transferred his entire consciousness into his body, preparing for a final bloody battle with the demonic energy, to save himself. The demonic energy still took shape as numerous serpents, opening their huge mouths as they lunged toward Myung. Myung jumped up to dodge the strike of one serpent, then kicked its body like a springboard, rapidly launching himself upward. He swung his sword, creating the sensation of splitting the world in two. Just then, a giant snake head lunged from the side, snapping Myung into its mouth. Myung quickly unleashed a spinning slash that tore through the snake's head and escaped. At the same time, he sensed something was wrong. The demonic energy was accelerating at a terrifying rate. Myung could no longer track the enemy's movements with his naked eye. The demonic snakehead swarmed and attacked him relentlessly, forcing him to desperately slash out dozens of times just to break free. Earlier, Myung was the hunter chasing down the demonic energy, but now the tables had turned, and the demonic energy was beating him like a drum. At this point, Myung was already worn out. If this situation dragged on any longer, his defeat would be inevitable. A giant serpent head lunged at Myung, forcing him to leap up to evade it. And right on cue, another snake shot out from the side and chomped down across his body. Myung still wanted to swing his sword to free himself, but another serpent suddenly lunged out and sank its fangs into his arm, causing him to drop the sword. That was all the opening they needed. The serpent-like demonic energies swarmed in from all directions, each one sinking its fangs into Myung's will, one bite at a time. If Myung didn't come up with a solution right now, his life would be over. But he still had one last move, left a move he really didn't want to use. If he made even the slightest mistake, both Myung's physical body and soul would suffer devastating damage. But compared to being completely devoured by the demonic energy, he had no choice but to risk it all. Myung began spreading his inner power to every corner of his body. Once the energy had filled every inch, the time had come. He was ready to self-detonate his inner force. The moment Myung's inner power exploded, his entire body echoed with sharp popping sounds like bursting popcorn. He felt as if his body were shattering into tiny pieces, but at least this desperate move worked. The demonic energy was being expelled from his body at high speed. Myung's body returned to its normal color, releasing steam as if he'd just been boiled. The moment he regained consciousness, he clutched his chest and shot upright. What a terrifying experience that had been. Even if he were paid, Myung wouldn't want to go through that again. With his current level still far too green, dealing with that demonic energy was incredibly dangerous. He only succeeded this time by sheer luck. At the same time, Lord Huang also regained consciousness on the bed. Seeing an unfamiliar kid standing right next to him made the old man quite curious. Myung congratulated Lord Huang on waking up. The two of them had just taken a stroll through the gates of the underworld and made it back alive. After fully regaining consciousness, Lord Huang immediately set to work reorganizing the Upper Grace escort group. Jabok was dragged out for interrogation. If his plan had succeeded, he would have slowly swallowed up the entire merchant group. His background wasn't anything special, he just a disciple of a merchant who once competed with Lord Huang. As for Jabok's pitiful, tearful pleas begging for mercy, Myung basically couldn't care less. The only thing Myung cared about was where Jabok had gotten the method to cultivate demonic arts. On that matter, Jabok confessed that he had simply stumbled upon the manual on a corpse deep in the mountains. Myung felt a bit disappointed, but in a way that was also a relief. If Jabok had truly been a seasoned demonic cultivator, there's no way he would have cooperated so obediently. In Myung's impression, demonic cultivators were all lunatics willing to do anything to achieve their goals. But this time, he'd successfully captured a fake demonic cultivator and saved Lord Huang, becoming the benefactor of the Upper Grace escort group, and was treated like an honored guest. Specifically, that meant he was given all the food and drink he wanted. While Myung was biting into a big chunk of meat and taking a hearty swig of wine, the voices of Lord Huang and his son echoed from outside the room. Lord Huang stepped in and took another good look to confirm whether the kid in front of him was really Myung. Hey, come on, he clearly saw Myung right after the treatment. Or maybe after days of non-stop feasting, Myung had chowed down so much he got all chubby and unrecognizable. Jonggi, standing nearby, had to admit that was entirely possible. In just a few days, Myung looked like he'd doubled in size. The first thing Lord Huang did upon entering the room was kneel down and sincerely express his gratitude for Myung's life-saving help. Ignoring his son's shocked reaction beside him, Lord Huang bowed deeply before Myung. Myung, still holding the wine jug with his mouth full, waved his hand and told Lord Huang to stand up. No need to be so formal. Lord Huang had already heard everything Myung had done for the Upper Grace escort group from his son, and he was deeply grateful. So if Myung had any request, he could speak freely. Old Huang would grant it no matter what. Myung, of course, had to act a bit first, putting on the noble look of someone who saved lives without expecting anything in return. He even said that if his master found out he was asking for rewards after saving someone, he'd get scolded for sure. Myung also casually reminded them that he had come here on his own, without even getting permission from his sect. He just made something up, saying the situation felt so urgent that he didn't have time to ask, and rushed straight to the Upper Grace escort group. Hearing that Lord Huang was moved to tears, this young man had been that desperate to save his life. That only made Lord Huang even more determined to repay Myung. Moreover, he also promised not to let Mount Hua know anything about the reward. That was exactly what Myung had been waiting for. He immediately pulled out a notebook he'd hidden in his robe. Myung explained that, well, he was getting on in years and worried about his memory, so he had to write everything down carefully, that's all. Father and son Huang were speechless hearing a kid claim he was getting on in years. But now that Lord Huang had said Myung could name any reward he wanted, Myung went ahead and started listing them, while carefully writing each one down at the same time. By sunset, the father and son returned to the study. After being treated by Myung, Lord Huang felt as if he had become 10 years younger. At that moment, Yonggi finally spoke up clearly, feeling a bit puzzled. He kept circling around topics like time, money, and all sorts of things, until Lord Huang had to urge his son to just get to the point already. After carefully choosing his words, Zhongui finally asked to confirm whether the Upper Grace Escort Group would really reduce dealings with the Southern Edge sect and shift their focus to investing in the Mount Hua sect instead. In Yonggui's eyes, the Southern Edge sect was still a powerful and influential force. Abandoning such a major faction to bet on the currently declining Mount Hua seemed like a risky and unwise gamble. Zhongyi understood that his father wanted to repay Myung for saving his life, but pouring too much investment into Mount Hua was still far too risky. After listening to his son's concerns, Lord Huang simply asked him to answer one question. What is the purpose of a merchant? Yonggi was stunned for a moment, then launched into a flowery speech about how merchants must dedicate themselves to this and that, full of lofty ideals and noble-sounding words. Lord Huang burst out laughing after hearing that. Why bother spouting all that flowery nonsense in front of your own father? He firmly stated that the duty of a merchant is to make money, even if it means throwing caution to the wind. For merchants, money is the true principle. Only with money can you trouble the world. Hearing his father say that Zhongui thought he was going to cancel the decision to cooperate with Mount Hua. But no, Lord Huang's greatest strength was his sharp eyes. Eyes that could spot business potential and opportunities to make money. It was under his leadership that the Upper Grace Escort Group had gradually grown into the largest merchant group in the region. Yonggi was deeply puzzled. He couldn't see anything in Mount Hua that was worth investing in at all. Lord Huang had to spell it out for him. Myung himself was the real investment. Maybe right now Mount Hua couldn't compare to Southern Edge, but Lord Huang was confident that under the right circumstances, Mount Hua would soon rise again. As long as the Upper Grace Escort Group stayed closely tied to Mount Hua, the potential profits would be immeasurable. But Zhongyi still couldn't shake off his concerns. If Mount Hua failed to grow, the merchant group would lose everything, and right now there was nothing concrete guaranteeing Mount Hua's success. Lord Huang sighed, thinking his son was still too green. If they can't see an opportunity, then just create one. Simple as that. The Upper Grace Escort Group couldn't just sit around waiting for Mount Hua to grow. They needed to be the ones to create that opportunity. Lord Huang saw immense potential in Myung, and that's exactly why he decided to go all in. Lord Huang advised his son not to rush to understand, just follow his lead for now. As long as the Upper Grace Escort Group stayed closely connected with Myung, the benefits would surely come in abundance. To be honest, Lord Huang had already toned it down quite a bit when talking about Myung. If he were to speak frankly, Myung was more like a demon than anything else. In the end, Zhongyi was convinced, though he still harbored some doubts.